梁歌制作，《隐形人》，作者赫伯特·乔治·威尔斯。第一章，第一个陌生人的到来。陌生人于2月之初，在一个寒冷的日子里，冒着刺骨的寒风和飞舞的雪花，踏着去年最后一场雪。
Production by Liang Gu, The Invisible Man, author, Herbert George Wells. Chapter 1, The Arrival of the First Stranger. On a cold day in early February, the stranger braved the biting cold wind and flying snowflakes to embark on the last journey of last year. Snow.
穿过荒野，从 Bramblehurst 火车站步行而来，手里紧握着一个小黑皮箱。他从头到脚裹得严严实实，柔软的毡帽檐遮住了他脸上的每一寸地方，只露出闪亮的鼻尖。
Walking through the wilderness, walking from Bramblehurst train station, clutching a small black leather suitcase. He was wrapped tightly from head to toe, and the brim of his soft felt hat covered every inch of his face, leaving only the shining tip of his nose exposed.
雪花堆在他的肩膀和胸膛上，给他的负担增添了一抹白色的坚定。他摇摇晃晃地走进马车与马酒店，比活人还死寂，把皮箱扔在地上。来点火，他喊道，为了人类的慈善。一间房和一炉火。
Snowflakes piled on his shoulders and chest, adding a white peak to his burden. He staggered into the coach and horse inn, deader than alive, and dropped his suitcase on the floor. Come and light a fire, he cried, for the charity of mankind. A room and a fire.
他在酒吧里跺脚，抖落身上的雪花，跟着后太太走进他的客厅去谈交易。就这样，加上把几枚金币扔在桌上，他在酒店里安顿了下来。夫人点燃了火，留他在那里。
He stomped around the bar, shook the snow off his body, and followed Mrs. Hall into her living room to discuss the deal. With that, and a few gold coins thrown on the table, he settled in the hotel. The lady lit the fire and left him there.
自己亲自为他准备了一顿饭。在冬天停留在依萍的客人是一件难得的好运，更不用说是一个不是讨价还价者的客人了。他决心证明自己配得上这份好运。当熏肉已经开始烹饪。
I personally prepared a meal for him. A guest staying in Yiping during the winter is a rare piece of good fortune, let alone one who is not a bargainer, and she is determined to prove herself worthy of the good fortune. While the bacon has started cooking.
他的淋巴县女仆米莉被一些巧妙选择的轻蔑之词激起了些许活力，他便拿着桌布、盘子和玻璃杯走进客厅，开始铺放它们，场面非常壮观。尽管火势旺盛。
Her lymph maid, Millie, a little stirred by some well-chosen contemptuous words, entered the drawing room with tablecloths, plates, and glasses, and began to lay them out with great spectacle. Although the fire is strong.
他惊讶地发现，他的访客仍然戴着帽子和外套，背对着他，凝视着窗外院子里飘落的雪花。他的手套手背相扣，似乎陷入了沉思。他注意到仍然落在他的肩膀上的融雪滴在他的地毯上。
She was surprised to see that her visitor, still wearing his hat and coat, had his back to her, staring out the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped together, as if deep in thought. She noticed the melting snow still falling on his shoulders, dripping onto her carpet.
我可以帮您拿帽子和外套吗，先生？他说，把它们拿到厨房好好烘干。不，他没有转身就说。他不确定自己是否听见了他的话， 正要重复他的问题。他转过身，从肩膀上方看着他。
Can I get your hat and coat, sir? She said, Take them to the kitchen and dry them properly. No, he said without turning around. She wasn't sure if she heard him and was about to repeat her question. He turned and looked over his shoulder. She.
我更喜欢带着它们，他强调地说。他注意到他戴着一副大号蓝色边框眼镜，领口上方有一撮浓密的侧须，完全遮住了他的脸颊和脸庞。非常好，先生，他说。您喜欢就好。
I prefer wearing them, he said emphatically, and she noticed that he wore large blue-rimmed glasses with a thick side mustache above his collar that completely obscured his cheeks and face. Very well, sir, she said. As long as you like it.
一会儿房间就会暖和了。他没有任何回答，再一次转过脸去。霍尔太太感觉到他的谈话时机不对，迅速地摆放好桌上的东西，然后匆匆离开了房间。当他回来时，他仍然站在那里。
The room will be warm in a while. He didn't answer and turned away again. Mrs. Hall felt that the timing of her conversation was wrong, quickly placed the things on the table, and then hurriedly left the room. When she came back, he was still stand there.
像一块石头般的人，背弯着，领子翻起，帽檐上的水滴向下垂，完全遮住了他的脸和耳朵。他把鸡蛋和培根重重地放下，对他大声喊，而不是说：“先生，您的午餐准备好了。”谢谢，他同时说道。
The man looks like a stone, with his back bent, his collar turned up, and the water droplets on the brim of his hat hanging down, completely covering his face and ears. She put the eggs and bacon down hard and shouted to him instead of saying, "Sir, your lunch is ready." "Thank you," he said at the same time.
直到他关上门才动弹一下，然后他迅速地转过身，带着一种急切的步伐走向桌子。当他走到吧台后面厨房时，他听到一个声音以固定的时间间隔重复：“切尔克，切尔克，切尔克。”
She didn't move until she closed the door. Then he turned quickly and walked towards the table with an eager step. As she walked to the kitchen behind the bar, she heard a voice repeating at regular intervals. Zilke, Zilke, Zilke.
声音是勺子在盆里快速搅拌的声音。那个女孩，她说：“看，我完全忘了，是她这么久还没做好。”在她自己完成芥末酱的搅拌的同时，她对米粒的过分缓慢进行了几句口头指责。
The sound was the sound of a spoon stirring rapidly in a basin. "That girl," she said. "Look. I totally forgot. It took her so long to make it." As she finished mixing the mustard herself, she gave Millie a few words of verbal rebuke for her slowness.
她煮了火腿蛋，摆好了桌子，做了所有的事情，而米粒真是帮了大忙，却只成功拖延了芥末酱。而且他还来了个新客人，还想留下来。然后他装满了芥末酱罐。
She cooked the ham and eggs, set the table and did everything while Millie, what a help, only succeeded in delaying the mustard. And he also has a new guest who wants to stay. Then she filled the mustard jar.
把它以一种庄重的姿态放在一个金色和黑色的茶盘上，把它端进了客厅。他敲了敲门，就迅速进来了。就在这时，他的访客也迅速移动，以至于他只瞥见一个白色物体在桌子后面消失。
Putting it on a gold and black tea tray in a solemn gesture, he carried it into the living room. She knocked on the door and came in quickly. Just then her visitor moved so quickly that she only caught a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table.
看起来他是在从地板上捡东西。他在桌子上的芥末罐上敲了一下，然后注意到外套和帽子已经被摘下，放在了火炉前的椅子上。一双湿靴子威胁着要生锈，他的钢制挡泥板。
It looked like he was picking something off the floor. She tapped the mustard jar on the table, then noticed that her coat and hat had been removed and placed on the chair in front of the fire, a pair of wet boots threatening to rust her steel fenders.
他毅然走向这些东西。我想我现在可以拿它们去晾干了，他用不容拒绝的语气说。把帽子摘下来，他的访客用含糊的声音说，然后转过身去，他看到他抬起了头，正坐着看着他。
She walked resolutely towards these things. I think I'll take them to dry now, she said in a tone that brooked no refusal. Take off your hat, said her visitor in a slurred voice, and turning around she saw that he had raised his head and was sitting looking at her.
他一时愣住，目瞪口呆地看着他，惊讶地说不出话来。他手持一块白色布料，是他随身携带的餐巾，覆盖在脸部的下方，以至于他的嘴巴和下巴完全被遮住，这就是他声音沙哑的原因。
She was stunned for a moment, staring at him dumbfounded, too surprised to speak. He was holding a piece of white cloth, the napkin he carried, covering the lower part of his face so that his mouth and chin were completely covered, which was why his voice was hoarse.
但这并不是让霍尔太太感到惊吓的原因。真正让她惊讶的是，她蓝色的眼镜上方整个前额都被一块白色绷带覆盖，另一块则覆盖了她的耳朵，除了她那粉红色尖尖的鼻子外。
But that wasn't what frightened Mrs. Hall. What really surprised her was that his entire forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and another covered his ears, except for his pink, pointy nose.
他的脸部没有任何地方露出来，那粉红色、明亮、闪亮的鼻子就像最初一样。他穿着一件深棕色天鹅绒夹克，领口高耸，里面是黑色亚麻衬里，翻领围在脖子上。
No part of his face is exposed. That pink, bright, shiny nose is just like it was in the beginning. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high collar, black linen lining, and lapels around his neck.
浓密的黑色头发从交叉绷带下方和之间逃逸出来，形成奇怪的尾巴和角，给他带来了一种难以想象的怪异外观。这个戴着口罩和绷带的头与他预期的完全不同。
Thick black hair escaped from beneath and between the crisscrossing bandages to form strange tails and horns, giving him an unimaginably grotesque appearance. The masked and bandaged head was nothing like he expected.
以至于他一时间僵硬在那里。他没有拿开餐巾，而是继续拿着它，就像他现在看到的一只棕色手套的手，戴着无法解读的蓝色眼镜看着他。把帽子放下，他说。
So much so that she froze there for a moment. He did not take the napkin away, but continued to hold it, as she saw now, a brown-gloved hand looking at her through unreadable blue spectacles. Hand down your hat, he said.
通过白色的布料清晰地说话，他的神经开始从所受的震惊中恢复。他再次把帽子放在了火炉边的椅子上。我不知道，先生，他开始说，然后他尴尬地停了下来。 谢谢，他干巴巴地说。
Speak clearly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock. She placed her hat again on the chair by the fire. I don't know, sir, she began, then she paused awkwardly. Thank you, he said dryly.
目光从他身上移到门口，然后又回到他身上。我马上把它们好好晾干，先生，他说，然后把他的衣服从房间里拿出来。他出门时又瞥了一眼他裹着白布的头和蓝色的护目镜。
His eyes moved from her to the door, then back to her. I'll dry them well at once, sir, she said, and took his clothes out of the room. She glanced once more at his white-wrapped head and blue goggles as she walked out.
但他的餐巾还是放在脸前。当他关上门后，他不禁打了个寒战，他的脸上充满了惊讶和困惑。我从未，他低声说。就这样，他轻轻地走到厨房，到达那里时太专注于自己的心思。
But his napkin remained in front of his face. After she closed the door, she couldn't help but shudder, her face full of surprise and confusion. I never, she whispered. That's it. She walked softly to the kitchen, too absorbed in her own thoughts when she got there.
以至于没有问米莉她现在在忙些什么。访客坐下，倾听她远去的脚步声。她在放下餐巾前好奇地望向窗外，然后继续用餐。她吃了一口，怀疑地望向窗外，又吃了一口，然后起身。
So much so that I didn't ask Millie what she was busy with now. The visitor sat down and listened to her retreating footsteps. He looked out the window curiously before setting down his napkin and continuing with his meal. He took a bite, looked out the window suspiciously, took another bite, and then stood up.
手里拿着餐巾，穿过房间，将窗帘拉到遮住下面窗户的白色亚麻布顶端，这使房间陷入黄昏之中。做完这件事后，他带着轻松的语气回到桌前，继续用餐。
Napkin in hand, you crossed the room and drew the curtains to the tops of the white linen that covered the window below. This plunged the room into dusk. After doing this, he returned to the table with a relaxed tone and continued to eat.
那个可怜的灵魂出了事故，或者做了手术什么的，霍尔太太说，那些绷带给我带来了多大的惊吓啊！他加了一些煤，展开衣架，把旅行者的外套搭在上面，还有那些护目镜。哎呀！
That poor soul had been in an accident or had an operation or something, said Mrs. Hall. What a fright those bandages gave me. She added some coal, unfolded the hanger, and put the traveler's coat on it. And those goggles, goops.
他看起来更像是个潜水头盔，而不是一个普通人。他在衣架的一个角落挂上了他的围巾，而且一直用手帕捂着嘴，通过手帕说话。也许他的嘴也受伤了，也许吧。他转过身。
He looks more like a diving helmet than an ordinary person. She hung his scarf on a corner of the hanger, and kept covering her mouth with a handkerchief. Talk through the handkerchief. Maybe his mouth was hurt too, maybe. She turned around.
像突然想起了什么。我的灵魂啊，他说，突然偏离了话题。米莉，土豆还没做好吗？当霍尔太太去清理那个陌生人的午餐时
Like suddenly remembering something. My soul, she said, suddenly digressing, Millie, aren't the potatoes ready yet? as Mrs. Hall went to clear the stranger's lunch.
他认为他在他所认为的那次事故中，嘴巴也一定被割伤或变形了的想法得到了确认，因为他正在抽烟斗。在他待在房间的整个时间里，他从未解开围在他脸下部分的丝质围巾。
Her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or deformed in what she believed to be the accident was confirmed by the fact that he was smoking a pipe and that during the entire time she was in the room he never untied the A silk scarf covering the lower part of his face.
将烟嘴放到嘴边，然而这不是遗忘，因为他看到他当烟头燃尽时瞥了他一眼。他坐在角落里，背对着窗帘。现在开始说话，已经吃过喝过，并且感到舒适的暖和。
Put the cigarette holder to your mouth. It was not forgetfulness, however, for she saw him glance at the cigarette as it burned out. He sat in the corner with his back to the curtain, now talking, having eaten and drank, and feeling comfortably warm.
比之前更加不具侵略性的简洁。火光的反光为他那副大眼镜增添了一种红色的生气，这是他们以前所缺少的。我有一些行李，他说，在 Bramblehurst 车站。
Less invasive simplicity than before. The reflection of the firelight gave his large glasses a red vitality that they had lacked before. I have some luggage, he said, at Bramblehurst Station.
然后他问他怎么才能让人把行李送过来。他礼貌地低头行礼，以示对他解释的认可。明天吗？他说，没有更快的方式吗？当他回答没有时，他似乎有些失望。他确定了吗？
Then he asked her how he could get the luggage delivered. He bowed his head politely to show his approval of her explanation. Tomorrow, he said. Isn't there a faster way? He seemed disappointed when she answered no. Is she sure?
没有哪个带着陷阱的人会过去的。Charles Hall 毫不犹豫地回答了他的问题，并展开了一段对话。先生，那是一条陡峭的下坡路。他回答关于陷阱的问题时说，然后抓住一个机会。
No one with a trap would get past it. Mrs. Hall answered his questions without hesitation and started a conversation. That's a steep downhill, sir, she said in response to a question about traps, then took a chance.
说道，那里1年多前发生了一起马车翻车的事故，一位绅士丧生，还有他的车夫。先生，事故总是在一瞬间发生，不是吗？但访客并不容易被吸引。他透过围巾说，他们确实如此。
Said, there was a carriage overturning accident there more than a year ago. A gentleman was killed, as well as his coachman. Sir, accidents always happen in an instant, don't they? But it's not easy for visitors. Attracted. They do, he said through the scarf.
然后透过他那难以穿透的眼睛，静静地打量着他。但是，他们恢复得够慢的，不是吗？这是我姐姐的儿子汤姆，他用镰刀割伤了手臂，在田野里摔倒了。哎呀，他绑了3个月，你几乎不敢相信。
Then he looked at her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. But they recovered slowly, didn't they? This is my sister's son Tom. He cut his arm with a scythe and fell down in the field, oops. He was tied up for 3 months. You can hardly believe it.
这让我对镰刀产生了恐惧，先生。我完全可以理解，访客说。他曾经害怕过，担心自己需要做手术，他的情况真的很糟糕，先生。访客突然大笑起来， 笑声如狗吠。
That gave me a fear of scythes, sir. I can totally understand that, the visitor said. He had been afraid that he would need surgery. He was in really bad shape, sir. The visitor suddenly burst into laughter, like a dog barking.
他似乎在嘴里咬住并扼杀了他。是吗？他说。他曾是，先生。对他们来说，这可不是一件可以笑的事情，因为他所做的事情，正如我所做的那样，我妹妹被她的孩子们占据了太多时间。先生。
He seemed to bite and strangle it in his mouth. Really, he said. He was, sir. To them, it was not a laughing matter because what he was doing, and what I was doing, was that my sister was taking up so much of her time with her kids. Gentlemen.
有绷带要包扎，也有绷带要解开。所以，如果我可以大胆地说，先生，你能给我拿些火柴吗？访客突然说道：“我的烟斗没火了。” Enhars Hall 突然被拉起。他告诉他自己做了什么之后。
There are bandages to put on and bandages to take off. So, if I may boldly say, Sir Dash. Can you get me some matches? Said the visitor suddenly. My pipe is out of fire. Mrs. Hall was suddenly pulled rise. After he told her what he had done.
这样做确实很无理。他对他惊呼了一会儿，想起了那2个金币。他拿起了火柴。谢谢，他简洁地说。当他放下它们时，他转过身去，背对着他，再次看向窗外。这实在太过令人沮丧。
It's really rude to do this. She exclaimed to him for a moment, remembering the 2 gold coins. She picked up the match. Thank you, he said tersely, and when she set them down, he turned his back to her and looked out the window again. This is so frustrating.
显然他对手术和绷带的话题很敏感。然而他并没有如此大胆地说，毕竟。但他的冷落方式让他感到恼火。那天下午，米莉过得非常不好。访客一直待在客厅里，直到4点钟。
Apparently he was sensitive to the subject of surgery and bandages. However, she didn't say it so boldly, after all. But his snubbing way annoyed her, and Millie had a very bad afternoon. The visitor remained in the drawing room until 4 o'clock.
没有给出任何打扰的借口。在这段时间里，他大部分时间都很安静。看起来他坐在逐渐变暗的房间里，在火光下吸烟，也许在打瞌睡。1次或2次，好奇的听众可能听到他在炉火旁。
No excuse was given for intrusion. He was quiet for much of this period. It looked like he was sitting in the darkening room, smoking by the light of the fire, perhaps dozing. Once or twice the curious listener might have heard him by the fire.
5分钟的时间里，他可以听到在房间里踱步的声音。他似乎是在自言自语。然后当他再次坐下时，扶手已发出了吱嘎声。第2章泰迪，亨弗雷先生的第一印象。4点钟，天色已相当昏暗。
For 5 minutes he could hear voices pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2 Mr. Teddy Humphrey's first impression. At 4 o'clock, it was already quite dark.
霍尔太太鼓起勇气要进去询问他的访客是否要喝茶时，钟表匠特迪·亨弗莱走进了酒吧。哎呀，霍尔太太，他说，但这样的天气穿薄靴子真是太糟糕了。外面的雪越下越快。 Mrs.
Just as Mrs. Hall worked up the courage to go in and ask her visitor if he wanted tea, Teddy Humphrey, the clockmaker, entered the bar. "Gee, Mrs. Hall," he said, "but it's too bad to wear thin boots in this weather." The snow was falling faster and faster outside. Mrs.
Hall 同意了，然后注意到他带着包。你现在来了，泰利先生，他说，如果你能看看客厅里的那座旧钟，我会很高兴。他走得很好，敲击有力，但时针只会指向6点。他走在前面。
Hall agreed, then noticed he was carrying a bag. "You are here now, Mr. Teddy," she said, "and I would be glad if you would look at the old clock in the drawing room. It runs well and strikes hard, but the hour hand will only point to 6 o'clock." She walked in front.
走到客厅门前，敲了敲门就进去了。他的访客，当他开门时看到的，正坐在壁炉前的扶手椅上，似乎在打盹，绑着绷带的头歪向一边。房间里唯一的光是来自火光的红色光芒。
He walked to the living room door, knocked and went in. Her visitor, whom she saw when she opened the door, was sitting in an armchair before the fire, seemingly dozing, his bandaged head tilted to one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire.
这光芒像相反的铁路信号一样照亮了他的眼睛，但他的低垂的脸却陷入黑暗，以及透过敞开的门进入的微弱日光的残余。对他来说，一切都很红润、模糊、不清晰。
The light illuminated his eyes like a reverse railroad signal, but his downcast face was plunged into darkness, and the remnants of the faint daylight that entered through the open door. To her, everything is ruddy, blurry, and unclear.
尤其是他刚刚点亮了酒吧灯，眼睛被晃花了。但有1秒钟，他觉得他看到的那个男人有一个巨大的嘴巴，张得大大的，一个巨大而不可思议的嘴巴吞下了他下半张脸。
Especially since she had just turned on the bar lights and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second, she thought the man she saw had a huge mouth gaping open, a mouth so vast and incredible that it swallowed the lower half of his face.
这是一种瞬间的感觉，白色的头箍，怪物的眼睛，以及他下面这个巨大的哈欠。然后他动了动，从椅子上站起来，举起手。他把门开得大大的，让房间更亮，他更清楚地看到他。
It's a momentary feeling, the white headband, the monster's bespectacled eyes, and this giant yawn beneath it. Then he stirred, rising from his chair and raising his hands. She opened the door wide, making the room brighter, and she could see him more clearly.
就像他之前看到的那样，围巾拉到了他的脸上。他觉得阴影欺骗了他。先生，您介意这位男士过来看看这个钟吗，先生？他从短暂的震惊中恢复过来，说道：“看看钟。”他一边说着。
Just like she'd seen before, the scarf was pulled over his face. She felt that the shadow had deceived her. "Sir, would you mind if this gentleman came over and looked at this clock, sir?" she said after recovering from her brief shock. "Look at the clock," he said.
一边昏昏欲睡地环顾四周，用手遮住嘴，然后完全清醒过来。当然 Mrs. Hall 离开去拿灯，他站起来伸了个懒腰。然后灯光亮了 ，Teddy Humphrey 先生进来了。
While looking around drowsily, he covered his mouth with his hand, and then, fully awake, he said, "Of course." Mrs. Hall left to get the lamp, and he stood up and stretched. Then the lights came on and Mr. Teddy Henfry came in.
面对这个绷带缠身的人，他说他感到惊讶。下午好，陌生人说着，打量着他，正如亨弗雷先生所说，带着对那副深色眼镜的生动印象，像一只龙虾。我希望亨弗雷先生说，这不算侵犯。
Face this bandaged man. He said he was surprised. Good afternoon, said the stranger, looking at him as Mr. Humphrey said, with a vivid impression of the dark spectacles like a lobster. I hope, said Mr. Humphrey, that this is not an intrusion.
什么都没有，陌生人说道。不过，我理解，他转向霍尔太太说，这个房间确实是给我的，供我私人使用。我想，先生，霍尔太太说，您可能更喜欢那个钟。当然，陌生人说，当然，但是通常我喜欢独处。
Nothing, said the stranger. But I understand, he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, that this room is indeed given to me, for my private use. I think, sir, said Mrs. Hall, you might prefer that clock. Of course, said the stranger, of course, but, as a rule, I like to be alone.
不受打扰，但我真的很高兴时钟得到了处理。他说，看到亨弗雷先生的举止中有一丝犹豫。非常高兴。亨弗雷先生本想道歉并撤退，但这种期待让他安心。陌生人转过身，背对着壁炉。
Uninterrupted. But I'm really glad the clock got taken care of, he said, seeing a hint of hesitation in Mr. Humphrey's demeanor. Very pleased. Mr. Humphrey was tempted to apologize and retreat, but the anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned his back to the fireplace.
把手放在背后，而且，他说，当钟表修理完毕后，我想我应该想喝点茶，但不是在修理完之前。Nunthras 后正要离开房间，这次他没有进行任何交谈。
Put your hands behind your back. And, he said, when the clock is repaired, I think I should like some tea. But not before. Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. This time she did not do anything chat.
因为他不想在 Humphrey 先生面前受到冷遇。这时，他的访客问他是否已经安排好他在 Bramblehurst 的箱子。他告诉他，他已经和邮递员提过这件事。
For she did not wish to be treated coldly in the presence of Mr. Henfry, when her visitor asked her whether she had made arrangements for his trunk at Bramblehurst. She told him that she had mentioned it to the postman.
搬运工明天可以把他们带来。你确定这是最早的时间？他问道。他确信，带着明显的冷漠。我应该解释，他补充道。我之前因为太冷和疲劳而没有做到的事情，那就是我是一名实验调查员。
The movers can bring them tomorrow. Are you sure this is the earliest time? He asked. She assured, with apparent indifference. I should explain, he added, something that I had not been able to do before because I was too cold and tired, and that is that I am an experimental investigator.
的确，先生，霍尔太太说，印象深刻。我的行李中装有设备和器具，确实是非常有用的东西，先生，霍尔太太说。我非常自然地渴望继续我的调查。当然，先生，我来依凭的原因。
Indeed, sir, said Mrs. Hall, impressed. My luggage contains equipment and utensils. Very useful stuff indeed, sir, said Mrs. Hall. I am quite naturally anxious to continue my inquiries. Of course, sir, the reason why I came to Yiping.
他带着一种深思熟虑的态度继续说：“是渴望独处。我不希望在工作时被打扰。除了我的工作，还有一次意外，我也这么想。”霍尔太太自言自语道：“需要一定的退休。我的眼睛。”
He continued with a thoughtful attitude. It's the desire to be alone. I don't want to be disturbed while I'm working. Besides my work, there was an accident dash. I think so too, Mrs. Hall said to herself. Needs a certain amount of retirement. My eyes.
有时如此虚弱和痛苦，以至于我不得不连续几个小时把自己关在黑暗中，把自己锁起来。有时，偶尔，现在当然不是。在这样的时刻，任何微小的打扰，陌生人的进入房间。
Sometimes it was so debilitating and painful that I had to shut myself in the dark for hours on end. Lock yourself up. Sometimes, occasionally. Of course not now. At such moments, any slightest interruption, the entry of a stranger into the room.
对我来说，都是一种难以忍受的烦恼。这些事情应该被理解是很自然的。当然，先生，霍尔太太说，如果我可以冒昧地问一下，我认为这就足够了。陌生人说着。
Are an intolerable annoyance to me. It is only natural that these things should be understood. Of course, sir, said Mrs. Hall, if I may venture to ask. I think that is enough, said the stranger.
带着那种他可以随意展现的平静而不可抗拒的决绝气息，霍尔太太把她的疑问和同情留到了更好的时机。在霍尔夫人离开房间后，他站在炉火前，瞪着，正如亨弗雷先生所说。
With that air of calm and irresistible determination that he could display at will. Mrs. Hall saved her questions and sympathy for a better time. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he stood before the fire, staring, as Mr. Humphrey said.
盯着钟表的修理。亨弗雷先生不仅取下了钟表的指针和表盘，还取出了机芯。他尽可能地以缓慢、安静和谦逊的方式工作。他靠近灯工作，绿色的灯罩将明亮的光线投射在他的手上。
Staring at the repair of the clock. Mr. Humphrey not only removed the clock's hands and dial, but also the movement. He worked as slowly, quietly, and humbly as possible. He worked close to the lamp, its green shade casting a bright light on his hands.
以及框架和轮子上，而其余的房间则显得阴暗。当他抬头看时，眼中出现了彩色的斑点。由于他天生好奇，他拆除了机芯，这是一项完全不必要的做法，目的是拖延他的离开。
And on frames and wheels, while the rest of the room appears gloomy. When he looked up, colorful spots appeared in his eyes. Due to his natural curiosity, he dismantled the movement, a completely unnecessary practice, in order to delay his departure.
也许能与陌生人交谈，但陌生人站在那里，完全沉默而静止。如此静止让亨弗雷感到不安。他觉得自己在房间里很孤单，抬头看去，那里灰暗而模糊，是包扎的头和巨大的蓝色镜片。
Maybe talk to strangers. But there the stranger stood, utterly silent and still. It was so still that Humphrey felt uneasy. He felt that he was alone in the room. He looked up and saw, dark and blurry, a bandaged head and huge blue lenses.
目光坚定地盯着， 前方漂浮着绿色的斑点。这对亨弗雷来说非常诡异，他们彼此对视了片刻，然后亨弗雷又低下头，非常不舒服的姿势，真想找个话题说点什么。他是否应该评论说
Staring firmly, green spots floated ahead. This was very eerie to Humphrey, and they stared at each other for a moment. Then Humphrey lowered his head again. Very uncomfortable position. I really want to find a topic to talk about. Should he comment?
对于这个季节来说，天气非常寒冷。他抬起头，仿佛要瞄准那开场的射击。天气，他开始说道：“你为什么不完成它就走？”那个僵硬的身影说，显然处于一种痛苦压抑的愤怒状态。
Very cold weather for this season. He raised his head as if to aim for the opening shot. The weather, he began. Why don't you just finish it and leave, said the stiff figure, obviously in a state of painfully suppressed anger.
你只需要把时针固定在轴上。你只是在胡说。当然，先生，再等1分钟。我疏忽了。然后亨弗雷先生说完就走了，但他感到极度烦恼地走了。亨弗雷先生自言自语道：“该死。”
You just need to hold the hour hand on the axis. You're just talking nonsense. Of course, sir, just one more minute. I was remiss, and Mr. Humphrey went away. But he went away feeling extremely troubled. Mr. Humphrey said to himself, "Damn it."
一边踩着融化的雪走向村庄，一个人总得时不时地修钟表，肯定得这么做。又来了，一个男人不能看你吗？丑陋？似乎不是。如果警察想要抓你，你不可能裹得更多，绑得更多。
While stepping on the melting snow towards the village, a man has to repair a clock from time to time. He must do it. Here it is again. Can't a man look at you? Ugly. It seems no. If the police want to arrest you, you cannot wrap yourself up more or tie you up more.
在格里森拐角处，他看到了霍尔。霍尔最近刚与那位陌生人的女主人马车与马匹结婚。现在偶尔有人需要时，他会驾驶依萍的交通工具去西德布里奇交汇处。
At the corner of Gleason he saw Hall, who had lately been married to the stranger's mistress, the carriage and horses, and who now occasionally drove Epping's conveyance to Hidbury when needed. Strange intersection.
他正从那个地方回来，向他这边走来。从他的驾驶方式来看，霍尔显然在西德布里奇稍作停留。你好吗，泰迪？他经过时说道。你在家喝了一杯烈酒？泰迪说。霍尔非常亲切地停下来。
He was coming back from that place and coming towards him. It was clear from the way he was driving that Hall was stopping at Hidbridge. How are you, Teddy? He said as he passed. You had a drink at home, said Teddy. Hall stopped very graciously.
那是什么？他问道。看起来像酒鬼的顾客停在马车和马酒吧。泰迪说：“我的天哪！”他接着给霍尔生动地描述了他的怪异客人，看起来有点像化妆，不是吗？如果他在我的地方停下来。
What is that? He asked. What looked like drunkards stopped at the carriage and horse, said Teddy. Oh my God. He went on to give Hall a vivid description of his strange guest. It looks a bit like a costume, doesn't it? If he stops at my place.
我想看看男人的脸，亨弗莱说。 但女人就是那么信任，对于陌生人来说，她占用了你的房间，甚至都没有留下名字。霍尔，你这么说的？霍尔说，他是个反应迟钝的人。是的，泰迪说。
I want to see a man's face, Humphrey said. But women are just so trusting, to strangers. He took your room and didn't even leave a name, Hall. You said so. Hall said he was slow to react. Yes, said Teddy.
最多1个星期，不管他是谁，1个星期内你是赶不走他的。而且他说明天会带来很多行李，所以希望不是箱子里装着石头。霍尔，他告诉霍尔
A week at most. No matter who he is, you can't get rid of him within a week. And he said he would bring a lot of luggage tomorrow, so I hope there aren't rocks in the box, Hall. He told Hall.
在黑斯廷斯的阿姨被一个陌生人用空的手提箱骗了。总的来说，这让霍尔有些怀疑。起来，老姑娘，霍尔说，我想我得去看看这件事了。泰迪拖着沉重的步伐前行，心中感到相当宽慰。然而
Anton Hastings was scammed by a stranger with an empty suitcase. Overall, it left Hall a little skeptical. Get up, old girl, Hall said. I guess I have to go take a look at this. Teddy dragged his heavy steps forward, feeling quite relieved. However,
霍尔在回家后，却因为他在 Cedar Bridge 停留的时间过长而遭到了妻子的严厉批评。他对妻子的温和询问得到了简短且不切要点的回答。尽管如此
on his return home, Hall was severely criticized by his wife for staying too long at Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were met with brief and to-the-point answers. Despite this,
特迪播下的怀疑种子在霍尔先生心中生根发芽。霍尔先生说，你这个女人不是什么都知道。他决心尽早了解这位客人的性格。陌生人上床睡觉后，大约9点半左右。
The seeds of doubt sown by Teddy took root in Mr. Hall's mind. You women don't know everything, said Mr. Hall, who was determined to get to know his guest's character as soon as possible. It was about 9:30 after the stranger went to bed.
霍尔先生非常积极地走进客厅，仔细地看了看妻子的家具，以表明陌生人不是这里的主人，并带着一丝轻蔑地仔细检查了陌生人留下的数学计算纸。当夜他睡觉前
Mr. Hall entered the drawing room very actively, looked at his wife's furniture carefully to show that the stranger was not the owner of the place, and examined with a hint of contempt the mathematical calculation paper left by the stranger. That night before he went to bed, Mr. Hall entered the drawing room very actively, looked at his wife's furniture carefully to show that the stranger was not the owner of the place, and examined with a hint of contempt the mathematical calculation paper left by the stranger. That night before he went to bed.
只是霍尔太太第二天仔细查看陌生人的行李。你管好自己的事，霍尔。霍尔太太说，我会管好我的。他更倾向于对霍尔发火，因为那个陌生人无疑是一个非常奇怪的陌生人。
Mrs. Hall was instructed to look carefully at the stranger's luggage the next day. Mind your own business, Hall, said Mrs. Hall, and I'll mind mine. She was more inclined to be angry with Hall, for the stranger was undoubtedly a very strange stranger.
他在心里对他也没有任何把握。在半夜醒来， 他梦见巨大的白色头颅像吴京一样跟在他身后，长长的脖子上还有大大的黑眼睛。但作为一个理智的女人，她压制了自己的恐惧。
She didn't have any confidence in him either. Waking up in the middle of the night, she dreamed of a huge white head following her like a turnip, with a long neck and big black eyes. But as a rational woman, she suppressed her fears.
翻了个身，又继续入睡。第3章1001屏，所以就在2月的第29天，解冻之初，这位非凡之人从无限之中跌落到了一平村。第2天，他的行李通过泥泞到达，而且行李非常引人注目。
Turned over and went back to sleep. Chapter 3 1001 bottles. So, on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this extraordinary man fell from infinity to Yiping village. The next day, his luggage arrived through the mud, and it was a sight to behold.
确实有2只箱子，就像一个理性的人可能需要的，但除此之外，还有一个装满书籍的盒子，大而厚的书籍，其中一些字迹难以辨认，以及1沓或更多的木箱、盒子、箱子。
There were 2 boxes, indeed, as a reasonable person might need, but beyond that there was a box full of books, big, thick books, some with illegible writing, and a dozen or more lots of wooden crates, boxes.
里面装着用稻草包装的物品，霍尔似乎带着一种随意的好奇在拉扯稻草、玻璃瓶。陌生人戴着帽子、外套、手套和披肩，不耐烦地出来迎接费伦西德的马车，而霍尔则在闲聊几句。
Inside were items wrapped in straw, which Hall seemed to be tugging at with a sense of casual curiosity, glass bottles. Strangers in hats, coats, gloves, and shawls came out impatiently to meet Fearenside's carriage, while Hall made small talk.
准备帮助他们把行李搬进来。他出来了，没有注意到费伦西德的狗。那只狗正带着一种业余爱好者的精神在嗅霍尔的大腿，带着那些箱子一起走。他说：“我已经等得太久了。”他走下楼梯。
Be prepared to help them move their luggage inside. He came out without noticing Fearenside's dog, which was sniffing Hall's thigh with the air of an amateur. Take those boxes with you, he said. I've waited too long. He went down the stairs.
朝着车尾走去，仿佛要动手搬起那个较小的板条箱。菲仁赛的狗一看到他，立刻竖起毛发，凶狠地咆哮起来。当他冲下楼梯时，狗犹豫地跳了一下。
He walked towards the back of the car, as if he was going to lift the smaller crate. As soon as Fearenside's dog saw him, it immediately bristled and growled fiercely. The dog jumped hesitantly as he rushed down the stairs.
然后猛地朝他的手扑来。呸！霍尔叫道，跳了回去，因为他并不是狗的英雄。Fearenside 喊道：“趴下！”然后抢起鞭子。他们看到狗的牙齿从手中滑落，听到一脚踢出。
Then he lunged toward his hand. Bah! Cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero to dogs, and Fearenside shouted, "Get down," and snatched up the whip. They saw the dog's teeth slip from their hands and heard a kick.
看到狗执行了一个侧跳，并跳到了陌生人的腿上，听到他的裤子被撕裂。接着，费伦赛德的鞭子尖端触及了他的财产，狗惊恐地尖叫着退到了马车车轮下。
The dog is seen performing a side jump and jumps into the stranger's lap, and his pants are heard being ripped. Then the tip of Fearenside's whip touched his property, and the dog shrieked in terror and retreated under the wheels of the carriage.
这一切都在短短半分钟内发生，没有人说话，大家都喊叫起来。陌生人迅速瞥了一眼自己被撕裂的手套和他的腿，仿佛要弯腰查看后者，然后转身迅速跑上楼梯进入旅馆。
This all happens in just half a minute. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced briefly at his torn glove and at his leg, as if stooping to examine the latter, then turned and ran quickly up the stairs and into the hotel.
他们听到他头也不回地穿过走廊，跑上未铺地毯的楼梯到他的房间。你这个粗人！费伦赛德说着，手里拿着鞭子从车上跳下来，而狗则透过车轮看着他。过来，费伦赛德说，你最好这么做。
They heard him running down the hall and up the uncarpeted stairs to his room without looking back. You bastard, said Fearenside, jumping out of the car with a whip in his hand, while the dog looked at him through the wheels. Come here, said Fearenside, you'd better do it.
霍尔站在那里目瞪口呆。他被咬了，霍尔说。我最好去看看。于是他追着陌生人跑去。他在走廊里遇到了霍尔太太。运送者有危险，他说，被咬了。他径直上楼，那陌生人的门半开着，他推开门。
Hall stood stunned. He was bitten, Hall said. I'd better go and see, and he ran after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the corridor. The carrier is in danger, he said, bitten. He went straight upstairs. The stranger's door was ajar, and he pushed it open.
毫无拘束地走了进去，因为他天生具有同情心。盲人不连放下，房间昏暗。他瞥见了一件非常奇特的东西，似乎是一只没有手的胳膊向他挥手。
He walked in without any inhibitions because he was naturally compassionate. The blind man's curtain was lowered, and the room was dark. He caught a glimpse of something very peculiar, what seemed to be a handless arm waving to him.
还有一张白色的脸上3个巨大的不确定的斑点，非常像一朵苍白的3色堇。接着，他被猛地击中胸部，被抛了回去。门在他面前砰地关上并锁上。这一切发生得太快，他都没有时间观察。
And 3 large uncertain spots on a white face, very much like a pale pansy. Then he was struck hard in the chest, thrown back, and the door slammed and locked in his face. It all happened so fast that he didn't have time to observe.
挥动的难以辨认的形状，一击，然后是撞击。他在黑暗的小楼梯上站立，想知道他可能看到了什么。几分钟之后，他重新加入了在马车与马匹外面形成的小团体。
An indecipherable shape of a swing, a blow, then a crash. He stood on the small dark staircase, wondering what he might have seen. A few minutes later he rejoined the small group that had formed outside the carriage and horses.
费伦赛德正在第2次讲述这一切。霍尔太太说他的狗没有理由咬他的客人。来自马路对面的杂货商赫克斯特正在提问。来自铁匠铺的桑迪·沃杰斯则显得公正，除了妇女和孩子们。
Firenside was telling all this for the second time. Mrs. Hall said there was no reason for his dog to bite her guest. Hexter, the grocer from across the road, was asking questions, and Sandy Vodgers from the blacksmith's shop was asking questions. Appeared just, except women and children.
他们都在说些愚蠢的话。他不会咬我，我知道，这样的狗是不对的。 它为什么要咬人呢？等等，先生，霍尔站在台阶上凝视着他们，倾听着，发现自己在楼上目睹了如此非凡的事情。
They all say stupid things. It won't bite me, I know it. This kind of dog is wrong. Why does it bite? Etc. Mr. Hall stood on the steps, gazing at them, listening, and found himself witnessing something so extraordinary upstairs.
这让他感到难以置信。此外，他的词汇量实在有限，无法表达他的感受。他不想接受任何帮助。他说，他对妻子的询问这样回答：我们最好帮他拿行李进去。他应该立刻进行烧灼处理。
This made him feel incredible. Furthermore, his vocabulary was too limited to express what he was feeling. He doesn't want any help, he said. He responded to his wife's inquiry. We'd better help him get his luggage inside. He should be cauterized immediately.
赫克斯先生说道，尤其是如果他有任何炎症的话。我会开枪，我会这么做，小组里的一个女士说。突然，狗又开始吠叫了。快进来！门口传来一个愤怒的声音，站着一个把领子翻起。
Especially if it has any inflammation, Mr. Huck said. I'll shoot it, I'll do it, said a woman in the group. Suddenly, the dog started barking again. Come in quickly, an angry voice came from the door. A man stood with his collar turned up.
帽檐压低的陌生人，你越快把那些东西拿进来，我就越高兴。据一个匿名的旁观者说，他的裤子和手套已经换过了。您受伤了吗，先生？费伦赛德问道。我非常抱歉，那个大一点也不。
A stranger with a lowered hat brim. The sooner you get those things in, the happier I'll be, said an anonymous onlooker, whose pants and gloves had already been changed. Are you hurt, sir? Asked Fearenside. I'm very sorry, that big. Not at all.
陌生人说，从未破皮，那些东西快点。他随后对自己发誓，正如霍尔先生所断言，直接将第一个箱子按照他的指示搬进了客厅。陌生人异常兴奋地扑上去，开始拆箱。
Said the stranger. Never broke the skin. Hurry up those things. He then swore to himself, as Mr. Hall asserted. He directly moved the first box into the living room according to his instructions. The stranger jumped on it with great excitement and began to unpack it.
完全不顾霍尔太太的地毯，把稻草散落一地。接着，他从箱子里拿出瓶子，小而丰满的装粉末的瓶子，细长的装彩色和白色液体的瓶子，带棱的蓝色瓶子，上面写着毒药，原附细颈的瓶子。
Completely ignoring Mrs. Hall's rug, she scattered the straw all over the floor. Then he took out bottles from the box, small, plump bottles for powders, slender bottles for colored and white liquids, ribbed blue bottles with poison written on them, bottles with round bellies and narrow necks.
大号的绿色玻璃瓶，大号的白色玻璃瓶，带玻璃塞和双洞标签的瓶子，带细软木塞的瓶子，带木塞的瓶子，酒瓶、沙拉油瓶，把它们一排排地放在梳妆台上、壁炉架上、窗户下的桌子上。
Large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frost labels, bottles with thin corks, bottles with wooden stoppers, wine bottles, salad oil bottles. Put them in a row place on the dresser, on the mantel, on the table under the window.
地板周围、书架上，到处都是。 布兰博希尔镇的药店不会有这么多。这景象真是壮观，一箱又一箱的打开，直到6个箱子都空了，桌子上堆满了稻草，除了瓶子。
Around the floor, on the bookshelves, everywhere. Bramble Hill won't have as many pharmacies. The sight was truly spectacular. Box after box was opened until all 6 boxes were empty and the table was covered with straw, except for the bottles.
这些箱子里还拿出了一些试管和一台精心包装的天平。直接将板条箱打开，陌生人走到窗边开始工作，对稻草的散落、熄灭的火、外面的书箱，以及已经搬上楼的行李箱和其他包裹。
Some test tubes and a carefully packaged scale were also taken out of these boxes. Opening the crate directly, the stranger went to the window and began to work, paying attention to the scattering of straw, the extinguished fire, the boxes of books outside, and the suitcases and other packages that had been carried upstairs.
都毫不在意。当霍尔太太把她的晚餐带进来时，她已经如此沉浸在工作当中，将小滴液体从瓶中倒入试管，以至于直到她清理掉大部分稻草，把托盘放在桌上，可能还带着一些强调。
None of them cared. When Mrs. Hall brought in his supper, he was so immersed in his work, pouring little drops of liquid from the bottle into the test tubes, that it was not until she had cleared away most of the straw and put the tray on the table that, perhaps with some emphasis.
看到地板那么脏乱，他才听到他的声音。然后他半转头，立刻又转开。但他看到他已经摘下了眼镜，他们在他身边的桌上，他觉得他的眼窝特别空洞。他再次戴上眼镜，然后转过身面向他。
He didn't hear her voice until he saw how dirty the floor was. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned away again. But she saw that he had taken off his spectacles. They were on the table beside him, and his eye sockets seemed to her particularly hollow. He put his glasses on again and turned to face her.
他正要抱怨地板上的稻草，但他预先阻止了他。我希望你不要不打招呼就进来。他用那种似乎很符合他个性的异常恼怒的语气说。我敲了敲门，但似乎也许你确实做了。但在我进行的
She was about to complain about the straw on the floor, but he forestalled her. I wish you wouldn't come in without saying hello, he said in that unusually exasperated tone that seemed to suit his personality. I knocked on the door, but it seemed, maybe you did. But while I was doing,
我真正非常紧急和必要的调查中，任何微小的干扰，门砰的一声，我必须问你。当然，先生，如果您想那样，可以转动锁，您知道的，随时都可以。这是一个非常好的主意，陌生人说。这所房子
In the midst of my truly urgent and necessary investigation, any slightest disturbance, a banging of the door, I must ask you. Of course, sir. You can turn the lock if you want that, you know. Any time. That's a very good idea, said the stranger. This house.
先生，如果我敢冒昧地说别，如果麦敢惹麻烦，就把他们算在账上。他含糊地对他说，听起来像是诅咒。他站在那里，如此奇特，如此具有攻击性和爆炸性，一只手拿着瓶子。
Sir, if I may venture to say. Don't. If the straws cause trouble, count them in the account. He said to her vaguely. It sounded like a curse. He stood there, so strange, so aggressive and explosive, with the bottle in one hand.
另一只手拿着试管，这让霍尔太太感到非常惊慌。但她是个坚定的女人。在这种情况下，我想知道，先生，您认为一枚先令放下一个先令，一枚先令难道还不够吗？就这样吧，霍尔太太说着。
The other hand held a test tube, much to Mrs. Hall's alarm. But she is a determined woman. In this case, I should like to know, sir, what do you think dash? A shilling, lay down a shilling. Isn't 1 shilling enough? Just so be it, said Mrs. Hall.
拿起桌布，开始把它铺在桌子上。如果你满意的话，当然，他转过身坐下，外套领子朝向他。他整个下午都关着门工作，正如霍尔太太所证实的，大部分时间都在沉默中。
Take the tablecloth and start spreading it on the table. If you're satisfied, of course dash. He turned around and sat down, his coat collar facing her. He worked all afternoon behind closed doors and, as Mrs. Hall testified, mostly in silence.
但有一次发生了碰撞，瓶子的碰撞声好像桌子被击中了一样，接着一个瓶子被猛地摔在地上，然后房间里快速地来回踱步。他担心出了什么事，走到门口去听，不想敲门。我无法继续了。
But once there was a collision, a clatter of bottles as if the table had been hit, then a bottle was slammed to the floor, and the room paced rapidly back and forth. Worried that something happened, she went to the door to listen, not wanting to knock. I can't continue.
他疯狂地喊道：“我无法继续了。30万，40万，庞大的人群。被骗了，可能要花我一生。耐心，确实耐心。愚蠢，愚蠢。”酒吧里砖块上发出铁钉的噪音，霍尔太太很不情愿地打断了他的独白。
He shouted frantically. I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000. Huge crowd. Being cheated. It might take me my whole life. Patience. Indeed patience. Stupid. Stupid. Bricks in the bar. There was a noise of iron nails, and Mrs. Hall reluctantly interrupted his monologue.
当他回来时，房间再次安静下来，只有他椅子的轻微摩擦声和偶尔瓶子的叮当声。一切都结束了，陌生人已经重新开始工作。当他端起他的茶时
When she returned, the room was quiet again, save for the slight scrape of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over, the stranger had gone back to work. When she picked up his tea,
他看到房间角落里，在凹面镜下有破碎的玻璃，还有一处被随意擦拭过的金色污渍。他引起了大家的注意，把它记在账单上。他的访客厉声说道：“看在上帝的份上，别烦我。”
She saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been wiped carelessly. She got everyone's attention. Put it on the bill, snapped her visitor, and for God's sake leave me alone.
如果造成了损坏，就记在账单上。然后他继续在他面前的练习本上勾画清单。我要告诉你一件事，费伦赛德神秘地说。那时已是傍晚时分，他们正身处一瓶汉格的小啤酒馆里。
If damage is done, put it on the bill, and he went on to draw a list on the exercise book in front of him. I'm going to tell you something, said Fearenside mysteriously. By then it was evening, and they were in a small beer hall in Ippinghanger. Huh?
泰迪·亨弗雷问道：“你说的这个人，我家的狗咬了。他是黑色的，至少他的腿是。我透过他裤子的破洞和手套的破洞看到了。你以为会露出一点粉色，对吧？没有，只有黑色。我告诉你。”
Teddy Humphrey asked. The man you're talking about was bitten by my dog. Well, he was black. At least, his legs were. I saw it through the holes in his pants and the holes in his gloves. Do you think it's gonna show a little bit of pink, right? No, I'm telling you.
他和我帽子一样黑。哎呀，亨弗雷说，这完全是个红鼻子案件。哎呀，他的鼻子红得像油漆一样。那是真的，费伦赛德说，我知道。我会告诉你我在想什么。那马是花斑马，泰迪。这里黑那里白。
His hat is as black as mine. Oops. This is totally a red nose case, Humphrey said. Heck, his nose is as red as paint. That's true, said Fearnside, I know it. I'll tell you what I'm thinking. That horse is a piebald horse, Teddy. Black here, white there.
一块一块的，他为此感到羞愧。它是一种半血统，颜色没有混合，而是变得斑驳。我以前听说过这样的事情，这在马匹中很常见，任何人都能看到。第4章，奇怪先生采访陌生人。
Piece by piece. He was ashamed of it. He is a half-blood and the colors do not blend but become mottled. I've heard of this happening before. This is common in horses and can be seen by anyone. Chapter 4 Mr. Strange interviews a stranger.
我已经详尽地描述了那个陌生人抵达依萍的经过，以便读者能够理解他留下的好奇印象。但除了2个奇怪的事件外，
I have given a detailed account of the stranger's arrival at Epping, that the reader may understand the curious impression which he made. Except for 2 strange incidents.
他直到俱乐部节庆那不同寻常的日子停留期间的情况，可以非常简略地略过。他与霍尔太太在家务纪律问题上发生了一些小冲突，但在4月底之前，也就是贫穷迹象开始显现之前，
The circumstances of his stay up to that unusual day of the club's festival can be passed over very briefly. He had some minor conflicts with Mrs. Hall over household discipline, but by the end of April, before the signs of poverty began to show,
他总是通过额外支付的方式轻易地压倒了霍尔太太。霍尔太太不喜欢他，每当有机会时，他都会谈论解雇他的必要性，但他主要通过明显地隐藏自己的厌恶。
he always easily outshone Mrs. Hall by paying extra. Mrs. Hall disliked him, and whenever opportunity arose he would talk of the necessity of firing him, but he concealed his dislike chiefly by being conspicuous.
尽可能地避免与这位访客接触，来表现出自己的不满。等到夏天吧，霍尔太太明智地说，当艺术家们开始到来时，那时我们再看。他可能有点傲慢，但账单按时结清就是按时结清。
Show displeasure by avoiding contact with the visitor as much as possible. Wait until the summer, Mrs. Hall said wisely, when the artists start arriving. We'll see then. He may be a little arrogant, but a bill paid on time is a bill paid on time.
无论你想说什么，陌生人不去教堂， 实际上在周日和没有宗教的日子之间也没有区别，甚至在着装上也是如此。他工作正如霍尔太太所想的那样，非常不稳定。有些日子他会早早下来。
Whatever you want to say. Stranger did not go to church, and there was virtually no difference between Sundays and non-religious days, not even in dress. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very precariously. Some days he would come down early.
一直忙碌，而其他日子他会晚起，在房间里踱步，大声地烦躁好几个小时，抽烟，在壁炉边的扶手椅上睡觉。他与村外的世界没有任何交流，他的脾气一直非常不稳定。
Always busy. Other days he would get up late, pace the room, fuss loudly for hours, smoke, and sleep in an armchair by the fire. He has no communication with the world outside the village. His temper had always been very unstable.
大部分时间，他的态度就像一个几乎无法忍受挑衅的人。有时东西会突然断裂、撕裂、压碎或破碎。他似乎处于一种极度慢性刺激之下。他低声自言自语的习惯逐渐养成。
Most of the time his attitude is that of a man who can barely stand provocation, and sometimes things snap, tear, crush or shatter. He seemed to be under a state of extreme chronic irritation. He gradually developed the habit of talking to himself in a low voice.
尽管霍尔太太认真地听着，但他也无法理解他所听到的。他很少在白天出国，但到了黄昏时分，他会裹得严严实实，几乎看不见的出去。无论天气冷不冷，他都会选择最偏僻的小路。
Although Mrs. Hall listened carefully, she could not understand what she heard. He rarely goes abroad during the day, but at dusk, he will go out bundled up and almost invisible. Regardless of whether the weather is cold or not, he will choose the most remote roads.
那些被树木和河岸遮挡的地方，他的眼睛和被绷带包裹的可怕面孔，在帽子下若隐若现，突然从黑暗中出现在一两个回家的工人面前，还有特迪、亨弗莱，在一个9点半的夜晚从
Those shaded by trees and riverbanks. His spectacles and hideous bandaged face, looming under his hat, suddenly appeared out of the darkness to one or two of the workmen who were returning home, and Teddy Humphrey, on a 9:30 night from.
红外套中跌落出来，被这个陌生人像骷髅一样的头，他手里拿着帽子，吓得不轻。那是因为旅馆门突然打开的灯光。那些在黄昏时分看到他的人，晚上会梦见鬼怪。
The man fell out of the red coat, and was frightened by the stranger's skeleton-like head. He was holding a hat in his hand, because of the sudden opening of the hotel door. Those who saw him at dusk, at night, would dream about ghosts.
似乎很难说他们是否比他更讨厌男孩，或者反过来。但无论如何，双方都明显地表现出足够的厌恶。这样一个外表和气质如此出色的人，
It seemed difficult to tell whether they hated the boy more than he did, or vice versa, but in any case, sufficient disgust was evident on both sides. Such a person with such outstanding appearance and temperament.
在依萍这样的村庄里，成为经常被讨论的主题是不可避免的。对他的职业的看法分歧很大。霍尔太太对这一点非常敏感。当被问及时，她非常谨慎地解释说，他是一个实验调查员。
It was inevitable that it would become a frequently discussed topic in a village like Yiping. Opinions on his career are divided. Mrs. Hall was very sensitive to this point. When asked, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator.
像害怕陷阱一样小心翼翼地重复着这些词语。当被问到实验调查员是什么时，他会带着一丝优越感说，大多数受过教育的人都知道这些事情，因此他会解释说他发现事物。他说
repeating these words carefully as if fearing a trap. When asked what an experimental investigator is, she will say with a hint of superiority that most educated people know these things, so she will explain that he finds things, she said.
他的访客曾经遭遇过一次意外，这让他的脸和手临时变色。由于他性格敏感，所以不愿意让这件事成为公众的话题。他听不到的地方，大多数人认为他是个罪犯。
Her visitor had suffered an accident which had temporarily discolored his face and hands, and because of his sensitive nature he was unwilling to let the matter become a public topic. She couldn't hear it, and most people thought he was a criminal.
试图通过把自己包裹起来，完全隐藏在警察的眼线之外来逃避正义。这个想法起源于特迪·亨弗雷先生的头脑。从2月中旬或月底以来，没有发生任何重大犯罪。
Trying to evade justice by wrapping yourself up and hiding completely from the police. The idea originated in the mind of Mr. Teddy Humphrey. There have been no major crimes since mid-February or the end of February.
在国家学校的试用期助理古尔德先生的想象中，这个理论变成了陌生人是一个伪装成无政府主义者的爆炸物制造者。他决定在他允许的时间内进行侦探工作。
In the imagination of Mr. Gould, a probationary assistant at the National School, the theory turned out that the stranger was an explosives maker masquerading as an anarchist, who decided to conduct detective work in the time he was allowed.
这些工作大部分是在他们遇到陌生人时非常仔细地观察他，或者询问从未见过陌生人的人，引导他们提出关于他的问题。但他没有发现任何线索。另一派观点追随费伦赛德先生。
Much of this work involves observing a stranger very carefully when they meet him, or asking people who have never met a stranger to lead them to ask questions about him. But he found no clues. Another school of thought follows Mr. Fearenside.
要么接受斑马的观点，要么对其进行某种修改。例如，希拉斯·达根，据说他断言，如果他选择在集市上展示自己，他很快就能发财。作为一个有点神学知识的人
Either accept Zebra's view, or modify it in some way. Silas Duggan, for example, is said to have asserted that, if he chose to display himself in the fair, he would soon be rich, as a man with some theological knowledge people.
他把陌生人比作那个只有一技之长的人。还有一种观点认为，陌生人是一个无害的疯子，这样解释整个问题。这种观点的好处是能够立刻解释一切。在这些主要群体之间
He compares the stranger to a person who has only one skill. There is also the idea that the stranger is a harmless madman, which explains the whole problem. The advantage of this perspective is that it explains everything at once. Between these major groups,
有动摇者和妥协者。萨塞克斯人迷信较少，只有在4月初的事件发生后，关于超自然的思想才在村子里悄然流传。即便如此，也只有妇女们才会相信。但无论他们怎么看待它
there are waivers and compromisers. The people of Sussex are less superstitious, and it was only after the events of early April that supernatural thoughts quietly circulated in the village. Even so, only women believe it. But no matter what they thought of him,
依平镇的人总体上都不喜欢他。他的易怒，虽然对于一个城市里的脑力工作者来说可能可以理解，但对于这些安静的萨塞克斯乡村村民来说，却是一件令人惊奇的事情。
People in Yiping Town generally dislike him. His irritability, while perhaps understandable to a city intellectual, was a surprising thing for these quiet Sussex country folk.
他们偶尔会看到他狂热的手势，夜幕降临时，他匆忙的脚步将他带到他们周围的安静角落。他对所有好奇尝试的无情打击，对黄昏的偏爱导致门被关上，窗帘被拉下，蜡烛和灯被熄灭。
They would occasionally see his feverish gestures, his hurried steps as night fell, leading him to quiet corners around them, his ruthless defeat of all attempts at curiosity, his preference for dusk that caused doors to be closed and curtains to be drawn. The candles and lamps were extinguished.
谁能同意这样的行为呢？当他经过村庄时，他们会让他通过；当他走过去后，年轻的幽默家们会竖起衣领，低下帽檐，紧张地模仿他的神秘举止，跟在他后面。
Who can agree with such behavior? As he passed through the villages, they would let him pass, and as he passed, the young humorists would follow him with their collars turned up and their hat brims lowered, nervously imitating his mysterious manner.
当时有一首流行的歌叫做《鬼怪》，斯塔切尔小姐在学校教室的音乐会上为了教堂的灯唱了这首歌。此后，每当几个村民聚在一起，陌生人出现时，
There was a popular song at that time called Ghost. Miss Starcher sang the song in a schoolroom concert, for the church lights, and thereafter whenever a few villagers got together and a stranger appeared.
他们中间就会吹奏这首曲子的一两个小节，音调或多或少尖锐或低沉。此外，迟到的孩子们会喊鬼怪，在他身后激动地匆匆离去。这位全科医生被好奇心吞噬。
Among them they would play a measure or two of the piece, in a more or less sharp or deep tone. In addition, children who arrived late would shout, "Ghost," after him and scurry away excitedly. Curse, the general practitioner, was consumed by curiosity.
绷带激起了他的专业兴趣，1001评的报告唤起了他的嫉妒之心。整个4月和5月，他渴望有机会与这位陌生人交谈。最后，在圣灵降临节前夕，他再也忍受不了。
The bandages aroused his professional interest, and the reports of 1001 bottles aroused his jealousy. Throughout April and May he longed for a chance to talk to this stranger, and finally, just before Whitsunday, he could stand it no longer.
便以订阅乡村护士名单为借口。他惊讶地发现，霍尔先生不知道他客人的名字。他提了一个名字，霍尔太太说，这是一个毫无根据的断言，但我没听清楚。
So I used the excuse of subscribing to the list of rural nurses. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. He mentioned a name, said Mrs. Hall, an unfounded assertion, but I didn't catch it.
他认为不知道这个男人的名字真是太愚蠢了。卡斯在客厅门口大声喊叫，然后走了进来。里面传来了一句相当刺耳的诅咒：“请原谅我的打扰。”卡斯说，然后门关上。
She thought it was stupid not to know the man's name. Cuss shouted loudly at the door of the living room, and then walked in. A rather harsh curse came from inside. "Excuse me for interrupting," Cuss said, and the door closed.
切断了霍尔太太与其他人的对话。他能听到接下来的10分钟里人们低语的声音，然后是一声惊叫，脚步的骚动，一把椅子被扔到一边，一阵笑声，快步走向门口。库斯出现了，脸色苍白。
Cutting off Mrs. Hall's conversation with the others. She could hear murmurings for the next 10 minutes, then a scream, a commotion of footsteps, a chair being thrown aside, a burst of laughter, a quick walk to the door, and Cuss appeared. Looking pale.
眼睛盯着他的肩膀后面。他留门开着，没有看他穿过大厅，走下楼梯。他听到他的脚步沿着道路匆忙前行。他手里拿着帽子。他站在门后，看着客厅敞开的门。
Eyes stared over his shoulder. He left the door open and without looking at her, walked through the hall and down the stairs, and she heard his footsteps hurrying along the road. He has a hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door to the living room.
然后他听到陌生人悄悄地笑了起来，接着他的脚步穿过房间。他站在那里，看不到他的脸。客厅的门砰的一声关上，这个地方又恢复了寂静。
Then she heard the stranger chuckle quietly, and then his footsteps crossed the room. She stood there unable to see his face. The door to the living room slammed shut, and silence returned to the place.
卡斯径直走到村子里的班廷牧师那里。我是不是疯了？卡斯一进门就突然问道。他走进了这个破旧的小书房。我看起来像疯子吗？发生了什么事？牧师问道。
Cuss walked straight to the village priest Bunting. Am I crazy? Cuss suddenly asked as soon as he entered the shabby little study. Do I look like a madman? What happened? The priest asked.
把菊石放在即将到来的布道稿的散页上。那家客栈里的那家伙，给我点喝的，库斯说，然后他坐了下来。当他的神经因一杯廉价的雪莉酒而稳定下来。
Place Ammonites on loose pages of upcoming sermons. That guy at the inn dash. Huh. Give me something to drink, Cuss said, and he sat down. As his nerves were steadied by a glass of cheap sherry.
这是那位善良的牧师唯一能提供的饮料。他告诉他刚刚的会面经历。进去，他喘着气说，开始要求为那个护士基金会捐款。我进来时，他把手插进口袋，笨拙地坐在椅子上，嗅了嗅。
It was the only drink the good priest could offer, and he told him about the meeting he had just had. Go in, he gasped, and start asking for donations to that nurse's fund. When I came in, he put his hands in his pockets and sat awkwardly in his chair. He sniffed.
我告诉他，我听说他对科学事物很感兴趣。他说是的，又嗅了嗅，一直都在嗅，显然刚刚得了个可怕的感冒。不奇怪，那样裹得紧紧的。我发展了护士这个想法，同时一直保持着警觉。瓶子。
I told him I'd heard he was interested in scientific things. He said yes. Sniffed again. He kept sniffing. Obviously he just had a terrible cold. Not surprising, it's so tightly wrapped. I developed the idea of a nurse, all the while remaining alert. Bottle.
化学品满处都是。天平，放在架上的试管， 还有一股晚锥的气味。他会捐款吗？说他会考虑。我直截了当地问他是否在进行研究。他说他在。一个长时间的研究。他变得非常生气。
Chemicals everywhere. The scales, the test tubes on the rack, and the smell of late mulberry. Will he donate? Said he would consider it. I asked him point blank whether he was conducting research. He said he was there. A long study? He became very angry.
这个该死的长时间研究，他吹开瓶塞，这么说。哦，我说，随之而出的是他的怨言。这个人刚刚要沸腾，我的问题让他沸腾了。他得到了一个处方，一个非常宝贵的处方，他莫说是什么用处。
This damn long study, he said, blowing the cork off the bottle. Oh, I said. And then came his complaint. The man was just boiling, and my questions made him boil. He gave me a prescription, a very valuable prescription. He didn't say what it was for.
是医学方面的吗？该死的！你在打什么主意？我道歉。他显得有点傲慢地嗅了嗅并咳嗽了。他继续说话。他已读过5种成分。放下，转过头，从窗户吹来的空气托起纸张，呼啸，沙沙声。
Is it medical? Damn. What are you planning? I apologized. He sniffed and coughed a bit haughtily. He continued talking. He has read it. 5 ingredients. Put down, turn your head. Air blowing in from the window lifts the paper. Whistling, rustling.
他说他在一个有开放式壁炉的房间里工作，看到一闪，处方正在燃烧，并升向烟囱，冲向他，就在他被卷入烟囱的时候。所以，就在那个时刻，为了说明他的故事，他的手臂伸了出来。很抱歉。
He said he worked in a room with an open fireplace. Saw a flash and the prescription was burning and rising up the chimney. Rushed towards it just as it is swept up the chimney. So, at that moment, to illustrate his story, his arm was extended. Terribly sorry.
您没有提供需要翻译的原文本，请提供您希望翻译成简体中文的文本，以便我能够为您进行翻译。没有手，只有空袖子。天哪！我以为那是畸形，大概是个墓壁，他把它摘下来了。
You did not provide source text for translation. Please provide the text you would like translated into simplified Chinese so I can translate it for you. Huh. No hands, just empty sleeves. Oh my God. I thought that was a deformity. Probably a wooden arm. He took it off.
然后我想，这有点奇怪。如果里面什么都没有，那是什么东西让袖子保持竖起和敞开的？我告诉你，里面什么都没有，一直到底部。我能看到，一直看到肘部，透过布的裂缝透出一丝光亮。
And then I thought, this is kind of weird. If there's nothing inside, what's keeping the sleeves up and open? I'm telling you, there's nothing in there, all the way to the bottom. I could see all the way up to my elbows, a sliver of light peeking through a rip in the cloth.
我的天啊！我说，然后他停了下来，用他那黑色的护目镜盯着我，然后又看他的袖子。那就算了。他一句话也没说， 只是瞪着眼，迅速地把袖子放回口袋里。我说的是，他说药房烧了。
OMG, I said. Then he stopped, staring at me with his black goggles, then at his sleeves. That's all. He didn't say a word. He just stared and quickly put his sleeve back into his pocket. What I'm saying is, he said, the prescription is burned.
不是吗？疑问的咳嗽。你怎么能？我说那样移动一个空袖子。空袖子。是的，我说一个空袖子。这是个空的袖子，对吧？你看到它是空的袖子了。他立刻站起来，我也站了起来。
No. A questioning cough. How could you, I said, move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeves? Yes, I said, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, isn't it? Did you see its empty sleeve? He stood up immediately. I stood up too.
他慢慢地走了3步，朝我走来，站得很近，恶狠狠地嗅了嗅。尽管我敢打赌，他那缠着绷带的头和那些眼罩足以让任何人感到不安。他悄无声息地靠近你。你说那是空的袖子？他说。当然。
He took 3 slow steps toward me and stood very close. He sniffed viciously. Although I bet his bandaged head and those blindfolds would be enough to unnerve anyone, he approaches you silently. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said. Of course.
我说，一个厚颜无耻的人不戴眼镜开始抓挠，然后他非常安静地从口袋里又抽出了袖子，举起手臂朝我，好像要再次给我看。他做得非常非常慢，我看着他，好像过了很久。我说。
I said. A cheeky man, without glasses, started scratching. Then very quietly he took his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm toward me, as if to show me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at him. It seemed like a long time. I said.
清了清嗓子，里面什么都没有。不得不说什么，我开始感到害怕。我能一直看到底部。他慢慢地伸向我，就像那样，直到手铐离我的脸只有6英寸。看到空袖子那样向你袭来。
Clearing his throat, there's nothing in there. What had to be said? I started to get scared. I could see all the way to the bottom. Slowly, slowly he reached towards me, like that, until the handcuffs were only 6 inches from my face. Seeing empty sleeves coming at you like that.
真是怪事。然后，某物感觉就像手指和拇指一样夹住了我的鼻子。布宁开始笑了。那里什么都没有。库斯说，他的声音在那里一词上升成尖叫。你笑得很好，但我告诉你，我太惊吓了。
What a strange thing. Then. Something, it felt like a finger and a thumb, pinched my nose. Boonin began to laugh. There is nothing there. Cuss said, his voice rising to a scream at the word, there. You have a good laugh, but I'm telling you, I was so scared.
我狠狠地打了他一下袖子，转身就跑出了房间。我把他留那儿了，咒骂停止了。他的恐慌真诚的不容置疑。他无助地转过身，又喝了一杯那位优秀牧师的劣质雪莉酒。 当我打他的袖子时，
I gave him a hard slap on the sleeve, turned and ran out of the room. I left him there. The swearing stopped. His panic was unmistakable. He turned around helplessly, had another glass of the good vicar's bad sherry, while I struck him on the sleeve.
库斯说：“我告诉你，感觉就像打在胳膊上，可那里没有胳膊，连胳膊的影子都没有。”布宁先生想了一会儿，他怀疑地看着库斯。这是一个非常了不起的故事，他说。
Kuss said, I'm telling you, it felt like a slap in the arm. But there was no arm there. There wasn't even a shadow of an arm. Mr. Boonin thought for a moment. He looked at Kusi suspiciously. It's a pretty remarkable story, he said.
他看起来确实非常聪明和严肃。确实如此，布宁先生带着司法的语气说：“这是一个非常了不起的故事。”第5章修道院长的盗窃啊。
He does look very smart and serious. Indeed, said Mr. Boonin in a judicial tone, it is a very remarkable story. Chapter 5 The Theft of the Abbot.
盗窃教堂牧师住宅的事实，主要通过牧师和他的妻子告诉我们。这起盗窃发生在圣三一节的凌晨，当天玉品村举行俱乐部庆典。似乎布宁太太在黎明前的静谧中突然醒来。
The facts of the burglary of the church parsonage are told to us chiefly through the minister and his wife. The theft occurred in the early hours of Trinity Day, during a club celebration in the village of Iping. It seemed as if Mrs. Boonin suddenly awoke in the pre-dawn silence.
强烈地感到他们卧室的门打开又关上。起初她没有叫醒丈夫，而是坐起身来聆听。然后她清楚地听到赤脚在相邻的更衣室里踏踏踏地走出来，沿着走廊走向楼梯。在她确信这一点后，
The intense feeling of their bedroom door opening and closing. At first she did not wake her husband, but sat up and listened. Then she distinctly heard bare feet stomping out of the adjacent dressing room and down the corridor toward the stairs. After she was convinced of this, the intense feeling of their bedroom door opening and closing. At first she did not wake her husband, but sat up and listened. Then she distinctly heard bare feet stomping out of the adjacent dressing room and down the corridor toward the stairs. After she was convinced of this,
她尽可能的轻柔地叫醒了牧师布宁先生。他没有开灯，而是戴上眼镜，穿上他的睡袍和他的浴鞋，走上去听听。他清楚地听到楼下书房里有摸索的声音，然后是一声强烈的打喷嚏。
She woke the Reverend Mr. Boonin as gently as she could. Instead of turning on the light, he put on his glasses, put on her nightgown and his shower shoes, and walked up to listen. He distinctly heard a fumbling sound in the study downstairs, followed by a strong sneeze.
在那之后，他回到了自己的卧室，拿起最明显的武器火钳，尽可能地悄无声息地下楼。班廷太太出现在楼梯平台上。大约4点钟，夜晚的极致黑暗已经过去。
After that, he returned to his bedroom, picked up his most obvious weapon, the poker, and made his way downstairs as quietly as possible. Mrs. Bunting appeared on the landing. About 4 o'clock, the ultimate darkness of the night had passed.
大厅里有一丝微弱的光芒闪烁，但书房的门道却黑洞洞的，无法穿透。一切都很安静，只有班廷先生脚步下楼梯的轻微吱嘎声和书房里轻微的移动。然后 突然间有什么东西断裂了。
There was a faint flicker of light in the hall, but the doorway to the study was dark and impenetrable. All was quiet except for the slight creak of Mr. Bunting's footsteps down the stairs and the slightest movement in the study. Then, suddenly something broke.
抽屉被打开，纸张的沙沙声响起，接着传来一声咒骂，火柴被划燃，书房被黄色光芒照亮。班廷先生现在在大厅里，透过门缝，他可以看到书桌和打开的抽屉，以及桌上燃烧的蜡烛。
The drawer was opened and there was a rustle of paper. Then there was a curse, the match was struck, and the study was illuminated by yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack in the door he could see the desk with its open drawers, and the candle burning on the table.
但他看不到那个盗贼，他站在大厅里犹豫不决，不知道该做什么。班廷太太脸色苍白而专注，慢慢地跟在他身后下楼。有一件事让班廷先生保持了勇气。
But he couldn't see the thief. As he stood in the hall hesitating, not knowing what to do, Mrs. Bunting, pale and attentive, followed him slowly downstairs. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage.
那就是这个窃贼是村里的居民的信念。他们听到了钱币的叮当声，意识到强盗找到了管家储备的金子，总共2英镑10先令，全部是半磅金币。听到这个声音，班廷先生立刻行动起来。
That was the belief that the thief was a resident of the village. They heard the jingle of coins and realized that the robbers had found the steward's stash of gold, £2 10 shillings in total, all in half-pound coins. At this sound Mr. Bunting sprang into action.
他紧紧握住火钳，冲进房间，班廷太太紧跟其后。投降！班廷先生大声喊道，然后惊讶地弯下腰。显然，房间里空无一人。然而，他们坚信自己那一刻听到了房间里有人移动。
Holding the poker tightly, he rushed into the room, followed by Mrs. Bunting. Surrender, cried Mr. Bunting, and bowed in surprise. Apparently, the room was empty. However, they firmly believed that they heard someone moving in the room at that moment.
这已经变成了确定性。或许有半分钟，他们张口结舌地站着，然后班廷太太穿过房间，看向屏幕后面，而班廷先生受到类似的冲动，窥视了桌子下面。接着，班廷太太拉上了窗帘。
This has become a certainty. For perhaps half a minute they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting crossed the room and looked behind the screen, and Mr. Bunting, feeling a similar impulse, peered under the table. Then Mrs. Bunting closed the curtains.
班廷先生抬头看向烟囱，并用拨火棍探查。然后，班廷太太仔细检查了废纸篓，班廷先生则打开了煤斗的盖子。然后他们停下来，互相用眼睛询问。我敢发誓，班廷先生说道。蜡烛。
Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed with his poker. Mrs. Bunting then examined the wastebasket carefully, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal hopper. Then they stopped and asked each other with their eyes. I swear, said Mr. Bunting. Candle.
班廷先生说道：“是谁点了蜡烛？”抽屉。班廷太太说：“钱不见了。”他急忙走到门口。在所有奇怪的事件中，在走廊里传来一声剧烈的喷嚏。他们急忙冲出去，这时厨房的门砰的一声关上了。
Said Mr. Bunting. Who lit the candle? Drawer, said Mrs. Bunting. The money is gone. She hurried to the door. Of all the strange occurrences, there was a violent sneeze in the corridor. They hurried out just as the kitchen door slammed shut.
拿蜡烛来，班廷先生说着，带头走了。他们俩都听到了匆忙上锁的声音。当他打开厨房门时，他透过餐具室看到后门刚好打开，微弱的晨曦之光映照出花园中黑暗的轮廓。
Bring the candle, said Mr. Bunting, leading the way. They both heard the hasty locking. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the pantry that the back door had just opened. A faint the light of morning illuminates the dark silhouettes of the garden.
他确信门里没有东西出去。门开了，敞开了一会儿，然后砰的一声关上。就在这时，班廷太太从书房拿着的蜡烛闪烁并燃烧起来。他们进入厨房1分钟或更长时间之后，
He was sure nothing was getting out through the door. The door opened, stayed open for a moment, then slammed shut. Just then the candle Mrs. Bunting was holding from the study flickered and burned. A minute or more after they entered the kitchen.
这个地方空无一人。他们重新锁好后门，仔细检查了厨房、储藏室和餐具室，最后走下地下室。无论他们怎么搜查，房子里都没有找到任何人。日光下，牧师和他的妻子。
The place was deserted. They relocked the back door, went through the kitchen, storage and pantry, and finally descended to the basement. No matter how much they searched, no one was found in the house. The pastor and his wife in the daylight.
这对穿着古怪的小夫妻仍然在自己的1楼闲逛，被一根摇曳的蜡烛的无关紧要的光线照耀着。第6章狂乱的家具现在就在圣灵降临节的清晨，在米莉被逐出屋外之前。
The young couple, oddly dressed, were still hanging out on their first floor, illuminated by the inconsequential light of a flickering candle. Chapter 6 The Furious Furniture. Now, on Whitsunday morning, before Millie is kicked out of the house.
霍尔先生和霍尔太太都起床，悄无声息地走下地下室。他们在那里的业务是私人的，与他们的啤酒比重有关。他们刚进入地下室。
Mr. and Mrs. Hall both got up and walked quietly down to the basement. Their business there is private and has to do with their beer proportions. They just entered the basement.
霍尔太太就发现自己忘记从他们的共用房间拿下一瓶蛇麻子酒。既然他是这方面的专家和主要操作者，霍尔先生很合适的上楼去取。在楼梯平台上
Mrs. Hall realized she had forgotten to take down a bottle of hops from their shared room. Since she was the expert and primary operator in this area, it was appropriate for Mr. Hall to go upstairs and get it. On the landing,
他惊讶地发现那个陌生人的门半开着。他继续走进自己的房间，按照指示找到了瓶子。但当他拿着瓶子回来时，他注意到前门上的螺栓被射了回去，门实际上只是拴上了。灵光一闪，
he was surprised to find the stranger's door ajar. He continued into his room and found the bottle as directed. But when he came back with the bottle, he noticed that the bolt on the front door had been shot back and the door was actually just bolted. A flash of inspiration.
他将这个情况与楼上陌生人的房间以及 Teddy Humphrey 先生的建议联系起来。他清楚地记得， 当后太太在夜间上锁时，她拿着蜡烛。看到这一幕，她停下来。
He related the situation to the stranger's room upstairs and Mr. Teddy Henfrey's suggestion. He distinctly remembered holding a candle while Mrs. Hall locked up the house for the night. Seeing this scene, he stopped.
目瞪口呆，然后仍然拿着瓶子又上楼去了。他敲了敲陌生人的门，没有回应。他又敲了一次，然后推开门走了进去。正如他所预料的那样，房间也是空的。更奇怪的是
He was stunned, and then went upstairs again, still holding the bottle. He knocked on the stranger's door. No response. He knocked again, then he opened the door and went in. Just as he expected. The bed and the room were also empty. What's even stranger is,
即使对他这样聪明的人来说，卧室椅子和床沿上散落着他们的客人的衣服。据他所知，这是唯一的一件衣服，还有他们的绷带。他那个大懒汉帽甚至歪戴在床柱上，显得颇为俏皮。
Even for a man as smart as he was, the bedroom chairs and the edge of the bed were strewn with their guests' clothes, the only ones that he knew of, and their bandages. His big slouch hat was even tilted on the bedpost, looking rather playful.
当霍尔站在那里时，他听到妻子的声音从地下室深处传来，那种快速的音节缩放和最后几个字的问句语气上扬至高音。这是西苏塞克斯村民常用来表示急躁不耐烦的方式。乔治
As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming from deep in the basement, with that rapid scaling of syllables and the last few words of the question rising to a high pitch that West Sussex villagers used to a way of expressing impatience. George.
你拿什么玩意儿？在哪？他转身匆匆向他走去。Jenny， 他说，越过地下室楼梯的扶手。Henfrey 说的是真的，他不在我们的房间里，他不在。前门也上了栓。起初
What are you holding? At that, he turned and hurried toward her. Janny, he said, looking over the banister of the basement stairs. Henfrey meant what he said. He's not in our room, he's not here. The front door was also bolted. At first.
霍尔太太并不理解，一旦明白，他就决定亲自去看看那空房间。霍尔先生仍然拿着瓶子，先走了。他说，如果他不在那里，他说，他的近处，那么他没带近处，那他在做什么呢？这真是太奇怪了。
Mrs. Hall did not understand, but once she did, she decided to see the empty room for herself. Mr. Hall, still holding the bottle, left first. If he's not there, he said, he's near. Then he's not bringing near, then what is he doing? That's really weird.
当他们走上地下室台阶时，两人都以为他们听到了前门开关的声音，但后来证实这只是错觉。当时他们都没有对彼此提起这件事。霍尔太太在走廊上超过了她的丈夫，先跑上楼。
As they walked up the basement steps, both thought they heard the front door open and close, but it turned out to be just an illusion and neither mentioned it to each other at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the corridor and ran upstairs first.
有人在楼梯上打了个喷嚏。霍尔在后面6步远的地方，以为是他听到了喷嚏声。他先跑上去，以为霍尔在打喷嚏。他猛地打开门，站在那里看着房间。真是奇怪，他说。
Someone sneezed on the stairs. Hall, 6 steps behind, thought he heard a sneeze. She ran up first, thinking Hall was sneezing. She threw the door open and stood looking into the room. "How strange," she said.
他听到头后传来一声清秀，似乎如此，转身一看，惊讶地发现霍尔站在最高一级楼梯上，距离他有12英尺。但转瞬间，他就站在了他身边。他向前弯腰，把手放在枕头上。
She heard a slight sniff behind her head, as it seemed, and turned around to see, to her surprise, Hall standing on the top step of the stairs, 12 feet away from her. But in an instant, he was standing next to her. She bent forward and placed her hands on the pillow.
然后伸到衣服下面。冷，他说，他已经起床1个多小时了。当他这么做的时候，发生了一件非常不寻常的事情。床单自动聚拢，突然跃起，形成一个山峰状，然后一头跳过了床脚的横梁。
Then reach under the clothes. Cold, she said, he's been up for more than an hour. When she did, something very unusual happened. The sheets automatically gathered together, suddenly jumped up to form a mountain peak, and then jumped over the beam at the foot of the bed.
这就像有人从中间抓住他们，把他们扔到一边。紧接着，那个陌生人的帽子从床柱上跳了下来，在空中画了一个半圆的旋转飞行，然后直冲向霍尔太太的脸。随后，海绵从洗手盆里飞来。
It's like someone grabbed them from the middle and threw them aside. Then the stranger's hat jumped off the bedpost, flew in a semicircle through the air, and flew straight into Mrs. Hall's face. Then the sponge flew from the wash basin.
接着是椅子，随意地把陌生人的外套和裤子扔到一边，用一种特别像陌生人的声音干笑，4条腿朝霍尔太太伸去，似乎瞄准了她，然后向她冲去。她尖叫着转身。
Then came the chair, casually throwing the stranger's coat and trousers aside, laughing dryly in a voice that sounded particularly stranger-like, stretching his 4 legs towards Mrs. Hall, seeming to aim at her, and then rushed towards her. She screamed and turned around.
然后椅子腿轻轻地但坚定地撞在他的背上，推动他和霍尔离开了房间。门猛地关上并锁上了。椅子和床似乎在那一刻跳起了胜利的舞蹈，然后突然间一切又恢复了平静。MRS.
Then the chair leg bumped gently but firmly into her back, propelling her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed shut and locked. The chair and bed seemed to do a dance of victory for that moment, and then suddenly everything was calm again. Mrs.
Hall 在后先生的怀抱中几乎晕倒在地毯上。后先生和 Millie 被他的惊叫声唤醒，费了很大力气才将他扶下楼梯。
Hall almost fainted on the carpet in Mr. Hall's arms. Mr. Hall and Millie, awakened by her screams, had great difficulty in getting her down the stairs.
并给他使用了在这种情况下通常使用的恢复药物。他很有勇气，霍尔太太说，我知道他很有勇气。我在报纸上读到过。桌椅跳跃和跳舞，再喝一口，詹妮，霍尔说，这会让你们稳下来。
And gave her the recovery drugs usually used in such cases. She has courage, said Mrs. Hall. I know she has courage. I read about it in the paper. The tables and chairs jumped and danced. Have another drink, James. Nay, Hall said, This will stabilize you.
把他锁在外面，霍尔太太说：“别让他再进来。”我猜了一半，我或许本该知道。他那瞪得大大的眼睛和缠着绷带的头，而且星期天从不去教堂。还有那些瓶子，多的任何人都没必要有那么多。
Lock him out, said Mrs. Hall, and don't let him in again. I half guessed. I probably should have known. He had wide eyes and a bandaged head, and he never went to church on Sundays. And those bottles, more than anyone would need to have.
他把灵魂都放到家具里去了。我那好家具，就是那把椅子上，我可怜亲爱的母亲在我还是个小女孩的时候常常坐着。没想到现在她竟然会反抗我。再低一点 ，Jenny， 霍尔说。
He put his soul into the furniture, my wonderful furniture. It was in that chair that my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. I didn't expect it to resist me now. A little more, Janny, Hall said.
你的神经都紧张了。他们把米莉送到对街，穿过金色5点钟的阳光，去唤醒铁匠桑迪·沃德格先生。霍尔先生的问候和楼上的家具表现得非常异常。沃德格先生会过来吗？
Your nerves are frayed. They sent Millie across the street, through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine, to awaken the blacksmith, Mr. Sandy Wodag. Mr. Hall's greeting and the furniture upstairs were unusual. Will Mr. Dirk come?
沃德格先生是个有见识的人，非常机智。他对这个案件非常严肃。如果那不是巫术，我就不信桑迪。桑迪，沃德格先生这样认为。你不会为这样的人物提供马蹄铁。
Mr. Wodag is a man of good sense and of great wit. He takes this case very seriously. If that wasn't witchcraft, my last name wouldn't be Sandy, thought Mr. Sandy Wodag. You would not provide horseshoes for such a character.
他非常关心地走了过来。他们想让他带路上楼到房间，但他似乎并不着急。他更愿意在走廊里交谈。就在这时，赫斯特的学徒走了出来，开始放下烟草窗的百叶窗。他被叫过去加入讨论。
He came over very concerned. They wanted him to lead them upstairs to their room, but he didn't seem in a hurry. He preferred to talk in the hallway. Just then Hurst's apprentice came out and began to lower the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion.
几分钟后，赫斯特先生自然跟了过来。盎格鲁撒克逊人在议会政府方面的天才显露出来，谈话很多，但没有决定性的行动。我们先谈谈事实，桑迪·沃格斯先生坚持说。
A few minutes later, Mr. Hurst naturally followed. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government was revealed. There was much talk but no decisive action. Let's talk about the facts first, insisted Mr. Sandy Vogels.
我们要确保我们打开那扇门是完全正确的。一旦门被破坏，它总是可以破坏的，但你不能破坏已经破坏的门。突然，奇妙的，楼上房间的门自己打开了，他们惊讶地抬头看去。
We want to make sure we do the right thing by opening that door. Once a door is destroyed, it is always destructible, but you cannot destroy a door that has already been destroyed. Suddenly, miraculously, the door to the room upstairs opened by itself, and they looked up in surprise.
只见那个陌生人戴着帽子，穿着斗篷，那双不合理的蓝色玻璃眼睛更加黑沉沉、空洞洞， 正从楼梯上走下来。他僵硬而缓慢地走下来，一直盯着看。他穿过走廊时还在盯着看。
I saw the stranger wearing a hat and a cloak, and his unreasonable blue glass eyes were darker and hollower, walking down the stairs. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring. He continued to stare as he passed through the corridor.
然后停了下来，看那里，他说。他们的目光随着他戴着手套的手指的方向望去，看到一瓶沙士酒就放在地窖门旁边。然后他走进客厅，突然迅速凶狠地关上了门，挡在了他们面前。
Then it stopped. Look there, he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved fingers and saw a bottle of root beer lying beside the cellar door. Then he walked into the living room and shut the door suddenly, quickly, and fiercely on them.
一句话也没有说，直到最后一声砰然声消失。他们互相凝视。唉，如果那样不能舔干净一切，瓦德格先生说道，而没有说出另一种可能。我会进去问问这件事，瓦德吉尔斯对霍尔先生说。
Not a word was said until the final thud died away. They stared at each other. Well, if that doesn't lick everything clean, said Mr. Waldeck, without mentioning the alternative. I'll go in and ask about it, said Rogers to Mr. Hall.
我会要求一个解释，需要一些时间才让女房东的丈夫达到那种程度。最后他敲了敲门，打开门，然后说道：“对不起，去你的！”陌生人用巨大的声音说，然后又说道：“你走后把门关上。”就这样。
I'll ask for an explanation. It took some time to get the landlady's husband to that point. Finally, he knocked on the door, opened it, and said, "I'm sorry, Fuck you," said the stranger in a loud voice, and then added, "Close the door after you leave. That's all."
简短的面试结束了。第7章陌生人的揭露。陌生人于早上5点半左右走进马车与马小客厅，直到中午前后一直待在那里，窗帘拉下，门关着。在霍尔拒绝他之后，没有人敢靠近他。
The short interview is over. Chapter 7 The Stranger's Revelation. The stranger walked into the small drawing room of the Carriage and Horses at about 5:30 in the morning, and stayed there until about noon, with the curtains drawn and the door closed. After Hall rejected him, no one dared to approach him.
他一定一直在绝食。他连续3次敲钟，第3次愤怒而猛烈地敲，但没有人回应他。他和他那见鬼去吧，霍尔太太说。不久，有关牧师住宅盗窃的不完整谣言传来，事情真相大白。
He must have been on hunger strike. He rang the bell 3 times in succession, the 3rd time angrily and violently, but no one answered him. He and his "go to hell," said Mrs. Hall. Soon, incomplete rumors spread about a burglary at the parsonage, and the truth came to light.
霍尔在瓦德格斯的帮助下，去找治安法官舒克福斯先生寻求他的建议。没有人敢上楼。陌生人如何打发时间，无人知晓。他时而愤怒地走来走去，2次爆发了咒骂，4回纸张。
Hall, with the help of Rogers, went to Mr. Shuckfus, the magistrate, to seek his advice. No one dared to go upstairs. How strangers spend their time is unknown. He walked around angrily at times, twice broke into expletives and tore up papers.
以及猛烈地摔碎瓶子。小群害怕但好奇的人们增多了。赫克斯太太走了过来， 一些穿着黑色线程夹克和细条纹直领带的快乐年轻人，因为是星期一，带着困惑的询问加入了人群。
And violently smashing bottles. The small group of scared but curious people grew. Mrs. Hex came over. Some cheerful young men in black off-the-rack jackets and pinstriped paper ties, for it was a Monday, joined the crowd with confused inquiries.
年轻的阿奇·哈克通过走上院子并试图从百叶窗下窥视来表现自己。他什么也没看到，但给出了他似乎看到了的理由。不久后，依萍的年轻人中也有些人加入了他的行列。
Young Archie Harker expressed himself by walking onto the yard and trying to peek under the blinds. He saw nothing, but gave reasons why he seemed to have seen it, and before long he was joined by some of the young men of Iping.
这是所有可能的 We Mondays 中最美好的一天。村庄街道上排列着健益达的摊位，一个射击场，在铁匠铺旁的草地上停放着3辆黄色和巧克力的马车。
It was the best of all possible Whit Mondays, with nearly a dozen stalls lining the village streets, a shooting gallery and 3 yellow and chocolate carriages parked on the grass next to the blacksmith shop.
还有一些男女游客在玩椰子游戏。绅士们穿着蓝色运动衫，女士们穿着白色围裙，戴着时尚的帽子，帽子上装饰着沉重的羽毛。来自子路。
There are also some male and female tourists playing coconut games. The gentlemen wore blue sweatshirts and the ladies wore white aprons and stylish hats decorated with heavy feathers. From Purple Deer.
The Watcher 和卖旧二手自行车的鞋匠 Mr. Jaggers 正在路上拉起一串英国国旗和皇家旗帜。这些旗帜最初是为了庆祝维多利亚女王第一次加冕纪念日而制作的。
Watcher and Mr. Jaggers, a shoemaker who sells old second-hand bicycles, are on the road pulling up a string of Union Jacks and Royal flags. These flags were originally made to celebrate the anniversary of Queen Victoria's first coronation.
在客厅里，人工的黑暗中，只有一束微弱的光线穿透进来。陌生人，我们假设他饥饿且害怕，隐藏在他不舒服的热包裹中，透过他的墨镜看着他的纸张，或者敲打他那脏兮兮的小瓶子。
In the living room, in the artificial darkness with only a faint ray of light filtering through, the stranger, who we assume is hungry and frightened, hidden in his uncomfortable thermal wrap, looks at his paper through his sunglasses, or banging his dirty little bottle.
偶尔对窗外的男孩们恶狠狠地咒骂，声音虽听得到，但看不见。壁炉角落里躺着半打碎瓶子的碎片，氯气的刺鼻气味污染了空气。
Occasionally he cursed viciously at the boys outside the window, his voice audible but not visible. Half a dozen broken bottles lay in the corner of the fireplace, and the pungent smell of chlorine polluted the air.
这些都是我们从当时听到的和后来在房间里看到的情况中知道的。大约中午时分，他突然打开客厅的门，站在那里，目光坚定地盯着酒吧里的3、4个人。霍尔太太，他说
This is all we know from what we heard at the time and what we saw in the room later. Around noon, he suddenly opened the door to the living room and stood there staring firmly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. Mrs. Hall, he said.
有人尴尬地叫了声霍尔太太。Mrs. Hall 过一会儿才出现，有点气喘吁吁，但正因为如此，他显得更加凶狠。Hall 还在外面，他对这个场景已经深思熟虑。
Someone called Mrs. Hall awkwardly. Mrs. Hall appeared after a while, a little out of breath. but because of this, she looked even more fierce. Hall is still outside. She had thought a lot about this scene.
手里拿着一个装有未结账单的小托盘走了过来。先生，您是要找您的账单吗？他说。为什么早餐没摆好？为什么你没有准备我的饭菜并回应我的铃声？你以为我不吃饭就能活着吗？
He came over holding a small tray with unpaid bills in his hand. Sir, are you looking for your bill? She said. Why wasn't breakfast set? Why didn't you prepare my meal and answer my ringtone? Do you think I can live without eating?
为什么我的账单还没付？霍尔太太问道。这正是我想知道的。我3天前就告诉你，我在等待一笔汇款。我2天前就告诉你，我不会等待任何汇款。如果你的早餐稍微等一下，你都不会抱怨。
Why hasn't my bill been paid yet? Asked Mrs. Hall. That's what I want to know. I told you 3 days ago that I was waiting for a remittance dash. I told you 2 days ago that I would not wait for any remittance. You won't complain if your breakfast takes a little while.
那我的账单已经等了5天了，你难道不会吗？陌生人简短而生动地发誓。那，从酒吧传来。如果您能不骂人，先生，我将非常感谢你，先生。霍尔太太说。陌生人站立在那里。
Then my bill has been waiting for 5 days, wouldn't you? The stranger swore briefly but vividly. Nah, came from the bar. I would be very grateful to you, sir, if you would stop swearing, sir, said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood there.
看起来比以往更像一个愤怒的潜水头盔。酒吧里每个人都觉得霍尔太太占了上风。他接下来的话也证实了这一点。看这里，我的好女士，他开始说道。别叫我好女人，霍尔太太说。
Looks more like an angry diving helmet than ever. Everyone in the bar felt that Mrs. Hall had the upper hand. His next words confirmed this. Look here, my good lady, he began. Don't call me good girl, Mrs. Hall said.
我已经告诉你我的汇款还没到。汇款确实，霍尔太太说。然而，我敢说，在我的口袋里，你3天前告诉我，你身上除了一个国王的银币外，别无他物。我又找到了一些乌拉从酒吧传来。
I already told you that my remittance has not arrived yet. Remittance is indeed, said Mrs. Hall. Yet, I dare say that in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you had nothing on you but a king's silver coin. Well, I found some more dash. Bula came from the bar.
我想知道你在哪里找到的，霍尔太太说。那似乎让陌生人非常恼火。他跺了跺脚。你这是什么意思？他说。我好奇你是从哪里找到的，霍尔太太说。在我拿任何账单。
I wonder where you found it, said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to irritate the stranger greatly. He stamped his foot. What do you mean? He said. I wonder where you found it, said Mrs. Hall. Before I get any bills. 吃早餐或者做任何这样的事情之前，你必须告诉我1、2件我不懂的事情，以及没有人懂的事情，还有每个人都非常渴望了解的事情。我想知道你在我楼上的椅子上做了什么。Before you eat breakfast or do anything like this, You must tell me a thing or two that I don't understand, and that no one understands, and that everyone is dying to know. I want to know what you did on my chair upstairs.
我想知道你的房间是怎么变得空的，你是怎么再次进来的？住在这栋房子里的人都是通过门进来的，这是房子的规矩，而你并没有这么做。我想知道你是怎么进来的。我还想知道，突然
I want to know how your room became empty and how you came in again. Everyone who lives in this house comes in through the door. That's the rule of the house. And you didn't do that, and I want to know how you got in. I still want to know. Suddenly.
陌生人举起紧握的手套，跺了跺脚，用如此异常的暴力说：“停下！”立刻让他哑口无言。你不理解，他说：“我是谁？我在做什么？我会让你看看。天哪！我会让你看看。”然后他用手掌遮住脸，又一开。
The stranger raised his clenched glove, stamped his foot, and said with such unusual violence, "Stop," which immediately rendered her speechless. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am and what I do. I'll show you. My God. I'll show you." Then he covered his face with his palms and spoke again, "Move away."
他的脸中央成了一个黑色的洞穴。在这里，他说，他向前迈步，递给霍尔太太一样东西。他盯着他变形的脸，自动地接了过去。然后，当他看到那是什么时，他大声尖叫，扔掉了它，踉跄着后退。
The center of his face became a black cave. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed something to Mrs. Hall. She stared at his deformed face and took it automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, threw it away, and stumbled back.
鼻子，那是陌生人的鼻子，粉红色且闪闪发光，在地上滚动。然后他摘下了眼镜，酒吧里的人齐声惊呼。他摘下帽子，猛地扯掉胡须和绷带。他们一时还抵抗着他。
Nose, that's a stranger's nose. Pink and sparkly, rolling on the ground. Then he took off his glasses, and everyone in the bar exclaimed. He took off his hat and yanked off his beard and bandages. For a moment they resisted him.
酒吧里闪过一阵可怕的预感。哦，我的家的！有人喊道。然后，他们纷纷脱落。这比任何事都糟糕。霍尔太太张着嘴巴，惊恐万分，对着他所看到的一切尖叫起来，然后朝房子的门奔去。
A terrible premonition flashed through the bar. "Oh, my God," someone shouted. Then they fell off. "This is worse than anything." Mrs. Hall, mouth open and horrified, screamed at what she saw and ran towards the door of the house.
每个人都开始移动，他们已经做好了准备，期待着疤痕、毁容、触目惊心的恐怖，但什么都没有。绷带和假发在通道中飞舞，进入酒吧，让一个蹒跚学步的孩子跳起来躲避。
Everyone starts moving. They were prepared, expecting scars, disfigurement, shocking horror, but nothing. Bandages and wigs flew down the aisles and into the bar, making a toddler jump for cover.
每个人都从楼梯上滚倒在地。那个站在那里大声喊叫着一些混乱解释的男人，他的一个坚定的手势形象一直延伸到他的上衣领口，然后什么都没有，什么也看不见。
Everyone tumbled down the stairs to the floor. The man who stood there shouting some confused explanation, with the image of a firm gesture extending up to the collar of his coat, and then, nothing to be seen.
村民们听到呼喊和尖叫声，抬头望向街道，看到马车和马正在猛烈地释放出它的人性。他们看到霍尔太太倒下，特迪·亨弗雷先生跳起来，避免跌倒在他身上。
The villagers heard shouts and screams and looked up into the street to see wagon and horse violently unleashing its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall and Mr. Teddy Humphrey jump up to avoid falling on her.
然后他们听到米莉的可怕尖叫声，她突然从厨房的骚乱声中冲出来，从后面撞上了无头陌生人。这些尖叫声突然增多。立即，整条街上的每个人都开始朝旅馆跑去。糖果摊贩。
Then they heard the terrible screams of Millie, who suddenly burst out from the commotion in the kitchen and bumped into the headless stranger from behind. There was a sudden increase in these screams. Immediately, everyone in the street started running towards the hotel, the candy vendors.
椰子店老板和他的助手，摇椅男子、小男孩、小女孩、乡村绅士、聪明的女子、穿着围裙的老年人以及吉普赛人，他们纷纷涌向旅馆。在极短的时间内，大约40人的群体迅速聚集。
The coconut shop owner and his assistant, the man in the rocking chair, the little boys and girls, the country gentlemen, the wise women, the old men in aprons, the gypsies, they all flocked to the hotel. In a very short period of time, a group of about 40 people quickly gathered.
在那里摇摆、呼喊、询问、惊呼和建议站在霍尔太太的店铺前，每个人都似乎急于同时说话，结果变成了混乱。一小群人支持霍尔太太，她被扶起时处于崩溃状态。举行了一次会议。
They're swaying, shouting, asking, exclamating, and advising, standing in front of Mrs. Hall's shop. Everyone seemed eager to speak at the same time and it turned into chaos. A small crowd supported Mrs. Hall, who was in a collapsed state as she was helped to her feet. A meeting was held.
一位大声疾呼的目击者的令人难以置信的证据。哦，妖怪，他到底做了什么？没伤到那个女孩吧？我相信他拿着刀冲过来。没有头，我告诉你，我不是那个意思。我是说没有头的人。胡说。
Incredible evidence from a witness who spoke out. Oh, monster. What did he do? Didn't he hurt the girl? I believe he came at me with a knife. Headless, I tell you. That's not what I meant. Headless man. Nonsense.
这是某种魔术。他揭开了他的包装，在努力穿过敞开的大门看个究竟时，人群形成了一个拖沓的楔形，最冒险的尖端靠近小酒馆。他站了一会儿，我听到女孩尖叫，然后他转身。
This is some kind of magic. He unwrapped his. In endeavoring to get through the open door to see what was going on, the crowd formed a dragging wedge, with the most adventurous tip near the tavern. He stood for a moment, I heard the girl scream and then he turned around.
我看到她的裙子飘动，她追了上去。没超过10秒钟，她拿着一把刀和一条面包回来了，就像在盯着看一样站着。就在刚才，她走进了那扇门。我告诉你，她根本没头，你差点错过。
I saw her skirt flutter and he ran after her. Not more than 10 seconds. He came back with a knife and a loaf of bread, stood as if staring. Just now. He walked through the door. I tell you, he has no head at all. You almost missed.
后方发生骚动，演讲者停下来，让位给一个坚定地向房子行进的队伍。首先是霍尔先生，脸色通红且坚定，接着是村里的警长鲍比·贾弗斯先生，然后是谨慎的沃德格斯先生。
There was a commotion in the rear, and the speakers paused to give way to a procession that marched steadily toward the house. First Mr. Hall, red-faced and determined, then Mr. Bobby Javers, the police constable of the village, and then the cautious Mr. Durgis.
他们现在手持搜查令而来，人们大声呼喊着关于最近情况相互矛盾的消息。有埃德还是没有埃德？贾夫斯说：“我得休息一下，休息一下我就去。”先生，霍尔走上台阶。
They're coming now with a search warrant. People were shouting conflicting messages about the recent situation. With Ed or without Ed, Javers said, I gotta take a break, and I'll take a break and I'll go. Mr. Hall walked up the steps.
径直走到客厅门口，猛地把它打开。警长，他说：“履行你的职责。”贾福尔斯走进来，下一个是霍尔，最后是沃杰斯。他们在微弱的光线中看到面前一个无头的人影。
He walked straight to the door of the living room and threw it open. Sheriff, he said, do your duty. Jaffers entered. Hall was next, and Vogers was last. In the dim light, they saw a headless figure in front of them.
一只戴着手套的手拿着一块被啃过的面包，另一只手拿着一块奶酪。就是他，霍尔说。这究竟是什么鬼？从那个身影的领口上方传来一阵愤怒的质问声。你是个该死的混蛋顾客，先生。
One gloved hand held a nibbled piece of bread, the other a block of cheese. That's him. Hall said. What the hell is this? A burst of angry questioning came from above the figure's collar. You're a damn bastard customer, sir.
贾夫斯先生说，但不管怎样，搜查令上写的是尸体，职责就是职责，让开。那个身影说着，向后退去。突然，他猛地抓起面包和奶酪，霍尔先生及时抓住桌上的刀，才阻止了他。
Mr. Javers said, but anyway, the search warrant says body, and duty is duty. Get out of the way, said the figure, stepping back. Suddenly, he grabbed the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall grabbed the knife on the table in time to stop him.
陌生人的左手套被扯掉，然后被扇到了杰弗斯的脸上。片刻之后，杰弗斯打断了他关于搜查令的一些陈述，紧紧抓住了他无手手腕，抓住了他看不见的喉咙。他遭到了一次响亮的踢击。
The stranger's left glove was ripped off and Jeffers was slapped in the face. Moments later, Jeffers interrupted some of his statements about the search warrant, grabbing his unseen wrist and grabbing his unseen throat. He received a loud kick.
让他大声喊叫，但他仍然紧紧抓住不放。霍尔把刀划过桌面递给了沃杰斯，他充当进攻的守门人，然后向前一步。当杰弗斯和陌生人摇摇晃晃地向他走来，紧紧抓住并击打他时
made him cry out, but he still held on. Hall slid the knife across the table to Vogers, who acted as gatekeeper for the offense, then stepped forward as Jeffers and the stranger staggered toward him, grabbing and striking him hour.
一把椅子挡在路中间，当他们一起倒下时， 椅子发出一声巨响。把脚弄好，贾夫斯咬牙切齿地说。霍尔先生试图遵照指示行事，结果被狠狠踢了一脚，肋骨一阵剧痛，使他暂时失去了平衡。
A chair stood in the middle of the road, making a loud thud as they fell together. Get your feet done, Javers said through gritted teeth. Mr. Hall, trying to follow the instructions, was kicked so hard that a sharp pain in his ribs caused him to temporarily lose his balance.
而瓦德格斯先生看到被斩首的陌生人已经翻过身来，占据了杰弗斯的上方，便手持刀子朝门口退去，与前来维护法律和秩序的赫克斯先生和西德布里奇车夫相撞。与此同时，
When Mr. Rogers saw that the decapitated stranger had turned over and occupied Jeffers, he retreated towards the door with a knife in hand, and met with Mr. Hucks and Sidney, who came to maintain law and order. Ricky Coachman crashes. At the same time,
从梳妆台上掉下3、4个瓶子，将辛辣的烟雾喷洒到房间空气中。我投降了，陌生人喊道。尽管他已经制服了贾夫斯，但片刻后他站起来喘着气，形象怪异，无头无手。
3 or 4 bottles fell from the dresser, spraying acrid smoke into the air of the room. I surrender, cried the stranger, and although he had subdued Javers, a moment later he stood up gasping, a grotesque figure, headless and handless.
因为他现在连右手的手套也扯了下来。他说：“没用了，仿佛在为呼吸而哭泣。这是世界上最奇怪的事情。听到那个声音，仿佛来自空无一物的空间。”
Because now he even took off the glove on his right hand. It's no use, he said, as if crying for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world, to hear that voice coming from nothing.
但萨塞克斯的农民可能是世界上最实事求是的人。贾夫斯也站起身来，拿出了一副手铐，然后他凝视着我说。贾夫斯说着，突然意识到整个事情的不协调，打断了自己的话。该死！
But Sussex farmers are probably the most practical people in the world. Javers stood up as well and took out a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. I say, Javers said, suddenly realizing the incongruity of the whole thing and interrupting himself, damn it.
我看不能这样用。陌生人将手臂从背心处滑下，仿佛有奇迹发生。他空荡荡的袖子所指的纽扣自动解开，然后他提到了自己的小腿，并弯下腰去。他似乎在摸索自己的鞋子和袜子。
I don't think it can be used like this. The stranger slipped his arms from his waistcoat, and as if by some miracle the buttons pointed to by his empty sleeves untied themselves. Then he raised his calves and bent over. He seemed to be groping for himself. Shoes and socks.
为什么？休斯特突然说，那根本不是人，那只是空的衣服。看，你可以看到他衣领和衬里的样子。我可以把我的手臂，他伸出手，似乎在空中触到了什么，然后他猛地抽回手。
Why? Huster suddenly said, that's not a human being at all. It was just empty clothes. Look. You can see what his collar and lining look like. I could put my arm. He held out his hand. Something seemed to touch the air, and then he jerked his hand away.
发出一声尖锐的惊叫。我希望你别把手指伸进我的眼睛里。空中传来一个声音，带着野蛮的责备口吻。事实上， 我全身都在这里，头、手、腿，还有其他所有部分，但恰好我隐形了。
Let out a high-pitched scream. I wish you wouldn't put your fingers in my eyes, came a voice from the air, with a savage reproach. Actually, my whole body is here, head, hands, legs, everything else, but I happen to be invisible.
这真是个讨厌的麻烦，但我确实如此。这难道不是理由？为什么每个愚蠢的乡巴佬都应该用手指戳得我粉碎吗？衣服现在都已解开，随意悬挂在看不见的支撑上，站立起来，双臂交叉。
It's such a nuisance, but I do. Isn't that the reason why every stupid redneck should poke me to pieces with his finger? Clothes, now unbuttoned and hanging haphazardly from invisible supports, stood up, arms crossed.
数名男子也进入了房间，因此人声鼎沸。隐形吗？休斯特说，对陌生人的侮辱不予理会。谁听说过这样的事情？奇怪，也许，但这不是犯罪。我为什么会被警察这样袭击？啊，这可是另一回事了。
Several men also entered the room, creating a buzz. Invisible, said Huster, ignoring the stranger's insult. Who has ever heard of such a thing? Weird, maybe, but it's not a crime. Why was I attacked like this by the police? Ah. This is another story.
贾福斯说，毫无疑问，在这种光线下你确实有点难以看清，但我有搜查令，一切都很正确。我追查的不是什么隐形，而是盗窃。有一所房子被盗，钱被拿走了。并且情况确实指向胡说八道。
Javers said. No doubt you do have a little difficulty seeing in this light, but I have a search warrant and everything is correct. It's not a stealth thing I'm after, it's a theft. There was a house broken into and money was taken. Huh. And the situation does point to dash. Nonsense.
隐形人说，我希望如此，先生，但我已经接到指示了。好吧，陌生人说，我会去的，我会去的，但不要手铐。这是常有的事，贾福斯说。不要手铐，陌生人规定道。对不起，贾福斯说。突然
said the invisible man. I hope so, sir, but I have been instructed. Well, said the stranger, I will go. I will go. But no handcuffs. It happens all the time, Javers said. No handcuffs, the stranger stipulated. I'm sorry, Javers said. Sudden.
那个人坐了下来，在任何人意识到发生了什么之前，拖鞋、袜子、裤子已经被踢到桌子下面。然后他又跳了起来，甩掉了外套。这里，停下！贾福斯说着，突然意识到发生了什么。他抓住背心。
The man sat down and before anyone realized what was happening, slippers, socks, and trousers were kicked under the table. Then he jumped up again and threw off his coat. Here, stop. Javers said, suddenly realizing what was happening. He grabbed the vest.
背心挣扎着，衬衫从背心里滑了出来，在他手中变得松软而空空如也。抓住他！贾福斯大声说：“一旦他脱掉那些东西，抓住他！”大家喊道，然后一拥而上，冲向那件飘动的白色衬衫。
The vest struggled and the shirt slipped out of it, becoming limp and empty in his hands. Get him! Javers yelled. Once he takes off those things, get him, everyone shouted, and then they rushed towards the flowing white shirt.
那是陌生人现在唯一可见的部分。衬衫袖子巧妙的一击打在霍尔脸上，阻止了他张开双臂的前进，使他向后倒在了老图索姆教堂司事身上。片刻之后，衣服被举起，剧烈地抽搐着。
That was the only part now visible to the stranger. A clever blow from the shirt sleeve struck Hall in the face, arresting his progress with outstretched arms, and causing him to fall backward against the old sexton of Tutholme. After a while, the clothes were lifted up and twitching violently.
在手臂周围空荡荡的挥舞，就像一件被人从头上推过去的衬衫。杰弗斯紧紧抓住他，却只是帮助把他扯了下来。他在空中被击中嘴巴，立刻扔掉他的警棍。
It waved hollowly around the arms like a shirt being pushed over one's head. Jeffers clung to it, but only helped to tear it off. He was struck in the mouth while mid-air and immediately dropped his baton.
猛地击打特迪·亨弗雷的头顶。小心！大家喊道，随意挥舞着剑，却什么都没击中。抓住他，关上门，别让他跑了。我找到东西了，他在这儿。他们发出一片混乱的嘈杂声。
A sharp blow to Teddy Humphrey's head. Be careful, everyone shouted, waving their swords randomly but hitting nothing. Get him. Close the door. Don't let him get away. I found something. He's here. They made a confused noise.
似乎每个人都同时被击中。桑迪·沃杰斯像往常一样机智，鼻子被重重一击后更加清醒，重新打开门，带领着众人撤退。其他人紧接着跟了上来，一时间被堵在门口的角落里。
Everyone seemed to be hit at the same time, and Sandy Vogels, as resourceful as ever and more sober from the blow to the nose, reopened the door and led the retreat. Others followed soon after and were blocked in the corner of the door for a while.
击打声持续不断。统一教徒菲普斯的门牙被打断了，亨弗莱的耳朵软骨受伤，贾福斯被击中下巴，转身抓住在混乱中挡在他和赫克斯特之间的东西，阻止了他们相遇。
The sound of beating continued. Phipps, a Unionist, had his front teeth broken and Humphrey suffered damage to the cartilage in his ear. Javers was struck in the jaw, turned and grabbed something that had come between him and Huckster in the confusion, preventing them from meeting.
他感觉到一个结实的胸膛，紧接着，整个混乱激动的男人群冲进了拥挤的大厅。我抓住他了，杰弗斯喊道。他几乎窒息，摇摇晃晃地穿过他们所有人。
He felt a solid chest, and then the whole chaotic and excited group of men rushed into the crowded hall. I've got him, cried Jeffers, nearly suffocating, staggering through them all.
用紫胀的脸和肿胀的血管与看不见的敌人搏斗，男子们左右摇晃。随着这场非凡的冲突迅速向房屋大门倾斜，他们滚下了旅店那6级台阶。杰弗斯用窒息的声音呼喊，尽管紧紧抓住。
Fight the invisible enemy with a purple face and swollen blood vessels. The men swayed from side to side, tumbling down the 6 steps of the hotel as the extraordinary conflict tilted rapidly toward the door of the house. Jeffers shouted in a strangled voice, despite holding on tightly.
却还是用膝盖挣扎，转身重重地摔倒在地，头部压在砾石上。直到那时，他的手指才放松。有兴奋的呼喊声抓住他。隐形， 等等，一个年轻人，这个地点的陌生人，名字无人知晓，立刻冲了进来。
But he still struggled with his knees, turned around, fell heavily to the ground, and pressed his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited shouts of, "Get him! Invisible!" and so on, and a young man, a stranger in this place, whose name no one knew, rushed in immediately.
抓住了一些东西，但没抓稳，摔倒在了警察倒地的身体上。半路上，一个妇女尖叫着，似乎有什么东西被她推了。一只狗显然被踢了，嚎叫着跑进赫斯特的院子里。就这样，
He grabbed something, but failed to hold it firmly, and fell on the policeman's fallen body. Halfway there, a woman screamed as if something had been pushed against her. A dog, apparently kicked, ran snarling into Hearst's yard, and that was it.
隐形人的穿越完成了。一时间，人们惊讶地指着，然后是恐慌，像一阵风把树叶吹散一样，把它们散布到村子里。但是贾福斯躺在旅馆台阶下，面朝上，膝盖弯曲。第8张图中
The Invisible Man's time travel is complete. For a moment people pointed in surprise, then panic, scattering them across the village like a gust of wind scattering leaves. But Javers lay at the foot of the hotel steps, face up, knees bent. Chapter 8 on the way.
第8章极其简短，讲述了该地区的业余自然学家吉本斯，当他躺在宽敞开阔的草原上，周围几英里内没有一个人，他以为如此，几乎要打盹时，他听到了附近有一个人咳嗽、打喷嚏。
Chapter 8 is extremely brief and tells the story of Gibbons, an amateur naturalist in the area. As he lay on a wide open prairie with no one around him for miles, thinking he was almost dozing off, he heard a voice nearby. Individuals cough and sneeze.
然后对自己粗鲁的咒骂的声音，他四处张望，却什么也没看到。然而声音是毫无疑问的。他继续以那种宽度和多样性咒骂，这是有教养的人咒骂的特点。声音达到了高潮，然后又减弱。
Then the voice cursed rudely to himself. He looked around, but saw nothing. The sound, however, is unmistakable. It continues to curse with that breadth and variety which characterizes the curses of educated people. The sound reaches a climax and then dies down again.
最后在远处消失，似乎在他看来是朝着艾德迪安的方向去的。声音突然变成一阵痉挛性的喷嚏，然后结束。吉本斯对早上的事件一无所知，但这个现象如此引人注目且令人不安。
Finally, it disappeared in the distance, seeming to him to be heading in the direction of Edion. The sound suddenly broke into a spasmodic sneeze and then ended. Gibbons knew nothing about the morning's events, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing.
以至于他的哲学平静消失了。他急忙起身，尽可能快地